sorry, but I am going to have to remove you from the room. What we are doing is we are live streaming all of our congressional debate semifinals. So on the Tab Room webpage, there is a Google Doc that has all of the live streaming links. Because there are 16 or 17 competitors in these rounds now, we just want to make sure that we are eliminating as much lag as we possibly can. So we are not going to allow observers in Zoom chat right now. So I am going to remove anybody who doesn't have participant or judge or parley or tab. There's also, it looks like an observer from John F. Kennedy, unless that is a participant who hasn't renamed themselves. So just FYI, if people complain about getting bumped from the rooms, I'm really sorry, but they are getting bumped from rooms today.
Ursula, I do not believe that that person is a participant, just so you know.
Okay. Oh, and they dropped by themselves, so. All right, so it looks like you're just waiting on Emily Donaldson.
I just have a question for judging. Sorry, this is my first round that I'm judging, so I haven't used the ballots yet. Where exactly do I find it? I can't find it anywhere.
Are you logged into tabroom.com?
Yes.
In the upper right-hand corner, you will see your email address.
Mm-hmm.
Click on that.
Okay. Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it'll be under current ballots and panels on the right-hand side.
Okay, and it looks like you have Emily Donaldson. So
hi, sorry about that. I had to restart my computer because it just was not working this morning. So my apologies.
Oh, no worries. We were just trying to make sure everybody is where they're supposed to be.
And you're still here before the round, so it's all good. Don't worry. No harm done at all.
All right, I'm going to go check in on Chamber 3. Katie, if you have any issues, use the tech email address that is listed on the Classrooms Cloud webpage, and that will go straight to us in Tab.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Welcome.
All right, folks, so we have a couple of minutes before the official start time. So I think now is a great time to just do a couple of things. Could I please get a thumbs up from our judges if they were able to find their ballots? Perfect.
I'm still working on it. It logged me out and it's making me reset my password and stuff, but now I know how to get to it, so I'll tell you when I have it up.
Okay, as soon as you have it up and ready to go, just let us know, because we won't begin the round until you have the ballot up.
Perfect.
In the meanwhile, it looks like we have everyone here. Everyone is on camera and everyone's microphone works. So we're off to a great start. We'll start with first introducing the judges. So I will kick us off. My name is Jordy. I'm your parliamentarian today. I'm a coach at Milburn High School in New Jersey. I'm currently in the great state of Nevada, however. I'm really excited to be here with you all. I competed in congressional debate back in the day, did 4 years of college debate, and I've coached ever since. Congress is definitely my passion, so really, really excited to be here and judge you all today, and really looking forward to an excellent round. Kayla, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kayla Rindak. I'm a coach at Louisville High School near Canton, Ohio. I competed for 3 years in high school. I've judged through college, and then I've been coaching ever since. So this is kind of my passionate category as well, but I do coach all of the debate categories, so I have a wide variety there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kayla. Katie, would you like to introduce yourself? I know that you're still working on Tab, but I'll have you do that.
Yeah, sorry, I was just on Tab Room there. I'm Kate. I also competed throughout high school. I went to Ridge High School in Basking Ridge, New Jersey back in the day. And yeah, I won the TOC in 2016. So I'm kind of a veteran of this tournament. So good luck to everybody. I know it's a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Kate. Okay, it looks like it is 8 o'clock. We're just going to wait to make sure that Kate can access her ballot. And once we get the go-ahead from her, we will get started.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm tapping I'm on current ballots here, and it's not showing up. So I'm just trying to figure out.
Yeah, and they just
why
switched
that's
me
happening.
over into this chamber also, so they might be switching you too.
Oh,
Gotcha. Yeah, because it's not showing up for me here yet for some reason. It should be under current ballots and panels, correct?
yes.
Yeah, it's whenever I click
just-
that, it comes up as a blank page.
I'm
I
just
don't know if
looking
this is
on.
helpful, but on the postings, I don't believe there's a key.
There's not.
Really? Okay, because they just told me by email that I'm in it. That's so strange.
Kate, give me just a moment. It's possible that they reassigned you.
Okay. Because I just spoke with Kevin like maybe 10 minutes ago, and he was like, oh yeah, you're in this room judging this rent, which I thought was odd because it wasn't on my tab room, but I
So
just
it
kind of...
looks like they have actually removed you from judging this round, and they have replaced you with Daniel.
Oh,
So I think
Okay.
that you're good to go. They might be reserving you for finals.
gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. Grant, sorry for all the tech issues then. I held it up for no reason.
Not a problem.
Good
Thanks
luck
so
with
much.
everything.
Not a
Bye,
problem.
guys.
Thank you. Dan, could you please introduce yourself to the chamber and then we'll get started?
Sure thing. Everyone, sorry for the late arrival, but they just moved me over a moment ago. So generally what I look for is a lot of like ref. I like the idea of it being an actual debate. I know there's a lot of stereotype in forensics about like, oh, this is actually a speech activity, right? Not a debate activity. I don't agree with that. I think that it's very important that you are, reading the room, that you're paying attention to speeches that came before yours and adjusting yours based off of that. What I don't think is good is when, it's just 15 prepackaged speeches that don't play off one another. So I think it's very important to be paying attention to what's going on in the chamber. If someone has given a speech similar to yours, it's kind of your job to adjust it on the fly to make yourself unique and stand out. Because for me, if two people have almost identical speeches, I'm going to look at the first one more favorably because they introduced a new idea rather than just reiterating what someone already said. So that's the number one thing for me. Other than that, I like humor. If you have something that's like an interesting hook or something like that, that's great. Just make sure that you're connecting to it and actually ties into the point you're trying to make, right? It shouldn't be there just for fluff. But in general, I'm pretty open to anything else that you guys want to do, but just try to keep it a debate rather than just a series of speeches.
Great, thanks so much, Dan. Well, it is currently 11:04 a.m. Eastern time, so I'm going to call this session to order. I'm not going to take a motion regarding presiding officer nominations. Instead, I've written down on a sheet of paper your two presiding officer candidates. The first one is Emily Donaldson, and I'm going to put that into this empty hat right here. Your second candidate is Aryan Rajan. I've got their name written down. I'm also going to put that into this hat. I'm going to randomly draw whoever is going to be the presiding officer for the first session. The other candidate will be the presiding officer for the second session. Are there any questions? Okay, I've been mixing it up in this hat. So your first presiding officer for today is Emily Donaldson. So I'm going to hand over the floor to Emily to continue. I'll be in the background. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm really happy to preside for you today for the first session. My name is Emily Donaldson, as you guys know. Before I open the floor for any docket nominations, I'm going to go over some of my procedures and background as to how this round will run. So first, I go off of NSDA procedures for both speaking and questioning reinforced in the TOC packet. So for speaking, I have designated time cards that you will receive at different points in your speech. When you reach 2 minutes, you will see this card held up to the screen. The same for 2 minutes and 30 seconds, then 2 minutes and 55 seconds, and 3 minutes. At 3 minutes and 5 seconds, I will put my hand up like this, which will emphasize that you have reached that time. As you proceed to near 3 minutes and 10 seconds, I will drop each one of my fingers to count down the seconds, and I will have a fist at 3 minutes and 10 seconds to emphasize your need to stop. In the TOC packet, your grace period extends to 3 minutes and 10 seconds and nothing beyond that. To make sure everyone in today's round gets equal speaking time, it's essential that we abide by that. Now, for questioning, I do this a little bit differently. I don't use time cards because I think it's difficult to identify the difference between 20 seconds and 30 seconds in the middle of a period. So I will hold my finger up for 20 seconds, and I will hold my fist for 30 seconds. When you reach 30 seconds, there will be no more back and forth, and I will immediately call on another questioner. Are there any questions for me before we begin? Senator I'm sorry, I can't see your name. Smith.
Thank you. So I know that there's a cap on the amount of speeches that every participant can have in finals. Does a cap exist in semifinals?
Right, so the way that the round is intended to run is that it's 2.5 hours from the time we start. I will do everything we can to make sure everyone has at least 2 speeches in this round. With the number of participants, that is our goal. No one should be able to have 3. That's not going to work within the time requirements. Also, additionally, in terms of prefacing, there's no specific procedure for that in the TOC or NSDA guidelines. However, if you're bringing up irrelevant information in other people's speeches, I think that looks bad for everyone. So I would advise that we don't do that. Are there any other questions? Senator Faraj. You're on mute.
Sorry, usually pressing my spacebar works to undo that. Do you want us to use the raise hand function to call on for like questioning or any of that, or are you going to notice our placards?
Yeah, so I was just about to describe that. So for questioning, I will say raise your placards to the screen, and everyone who wants to have a question will raise their placard. For a point of personal privilege, you will use the clap reaction in the Zoom function call. That way we don't have to stop the entire session for a point of personal privilege. If you need to use it, go ahead and take it.
Okay,
That's
thank you so much.
speeches, by the way, raise your placard to the screen. Are there any other questions for me? Seeing none, I now entertain motions for docket nominations. Senator Khan.
I move to nominate docket A, which reads SF1B, SF1C, SF1A.
Are there any other docket nominations on the floor? Senator Zhao, did you have one?
Sorry, I was going to motion to close the floor.
Okay, Senator Zhao, motion to close the floor. Any seconds?
Second.
Any opposed? Seeing none, we will proceed with docket A.
Sorry, opposed.
Okay, just for the chamber, if you can leave your placard to the screen, that would be helpful so I can make sure I can see everyone. But yes, Senator Joel.
Motion to nominate docket B consisting of SF A and SFB and SFC.
Are there any other docket nominations on the floor? Seeing none, I'll unilaterally close the floor, and we will now vote between docket A and docket B. If everyone wants to write this down, docket A consists of SF1B, SF1C, and SF1A. Docket B consists of SFA, SFB, and SFC, all in session 1, of course. All those who wish to pass docket A, raise your placards to the screen and keep them risen. All those who wish to pass docket B. It's clear majority for docket A, so we will proceed for piece of legislation SF1B. Are there any sponsorships? Raise your placards to the screen.
Senator Donaldson,
Khan.
before you continue, we do have a couple of observers in our Zoom call. Observers are not permitted in the Zoom call. Please exit the Zoom so that we can have the maximum capacity possible in order to stream this on YouTube. So asking observers again, please exit this Zoom call and go ahead and watch this on YouTube. I apologize. Thank you so much. Please continue.
Jordy, you're not going to have to do that anymore. I'm going to bounce people throughout the concession. So
Great. Perfect. Thank you.
I did call on Senator Khan for the sponsorship, so he will be the first one to give it on SF1B.
I thank the chair. Good morning, everyone. I'm Representative Isaac Khan speaking for the first time this session. Just a signal whenever you're ready would be awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. In my office on Capitol Hill, I have a motivational poster from a team building exercise we did that involved every single government worker. And it says team Together, everyone achieves more. And as a community gesture, every person signed it, except for the 200 workers of the US Trade Representative's office, because they believe on functioning on their own without oversight. Team up with me to reform Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. So first, I need to tell this Congress what exactly Section 301 of the Trade Act does. It essentially gives the executive branch the authority to respond to unfair trade practices by giving the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative the sole ability to enact tariffs upon other countries. But that has become especially problematic in the status quo because the Trump administration has been bypassing congressional oversight to impose unilateral tariffs, causing international fallout for the United States. Chad Brown, writing for the Peterson Institute of International Economics, explains on August 3rd of 2017 that the Trump administration's use of unilateral Section 301 tariffs causes global attention to shift away from what China is alleged to be doing wrong. Instead, the world focuses on the United States' own failure to follow the US designed and internationally agreed upon trade rules. Executive use of Section 301 means serious risks, especially if it results in tariff retaliation against China. And now that there is a functioning rules-based trading system that has been established globally, unlike in the 1980s, there is much more for us to lose. Another unchecked decision by the executive will spur China to follow suit. No longer will the United States be viewed as a beacon of hope when it comes to economic promise, but a warning sign of distrust. However, the impacts of this executive overreach is far beyond just diplomatic losses. Erica York, writing for the Tax Foundation on February 14th of 2020, explains that Section 301 tariffs imposed so far by the Trump administration are estimated to reduce long-run GDP by 0.23%, wages by 2%, and employment by 179,000 full-time jobs. Those jobs are held by Americans, and they're why you support my legislation, because Section 1A of my legislation requires the USTR to obtain congressional approval for Section 301 investigations, which places oversight back in the hands of this Congress. Vicki Needham, writing for The Hill on September 26th of 2018, explains that although the power to impose tariffs is one our Constitution grants to this Congress, modern history is filled with examples of the executive branch imposing tariffs without congressional approval. Given the recent event of the trade war with China, we need to reclaim our seats at the table. Giving Congress oversight over Section 301 allows us to take a more proactive role in trade policy. No president should have unlimited powers, especially when those powers are hurting innocent farmers and businesses. Indifference isn't going to create change, but passing will. I have another motivational poster in my office. It reads that there is no I in team, but there is one in a firm. Take responsibility and pass my legislation.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards. Senator Boko.
Okay, hi. So who exactly is in charge of making these unilateral retaliatory decisions?
Right now, that's the U.S. Office of the Trade Representative.
So does the U.S. office make the decisions, or do they recommend it to Trump, who eventually places the tariffs?
Right, obviously they make the investigations and put the tariffs on with President Trump's approval, but the problem is that that still gives all the power to the executive branch, and there's no checks and balances with Congress.
So regarding the USTR, have they necessarily done anything wrong to where they need congressional oversight?
Thank you, Senator Hurley.
Hello, Senator. So you brought up farmers towards the end of your speech. Can you give any quantifiable number about how trade tariffs are directly impacting them right now?
Right. I don't have the exact numbers with me, but I do know that the Chinese trade tariffs have significantly hurt farmers in the Midwest with soy products and all of that.
Now, has that impact came from the fact we're trading less with China, or can you elaborate a little further on exactly how that's occurring?
It's come from the Section 301 tariffs between the United States and China that then sparked the domestic trade war.
Thank you, Senator. I want to talk a little bit about 310 and 301 versus 232. Did the Trump administration put tariffs under 232 or 301 with the Chinese tariffs war?
So the Trump administration utilized both Section 232 and 301, but this legislation still gives Congress oversight over the process in this specific instance.
Okay, and specifically within this legislation, is it saying about the investigation and action under 301 or 310 of the U.S. Trade Act?
It's 301 of the Trade
Senator
Act.
Javarie.
Thank you. Hi, Mr. Khan. So Section 2A of this legislation explains that the office is going to be rendering a decision in 45 days, right?
Yes.
So if the office is in control of President Trump, what stops Trump from just advising the office to do what he likes?
That's why congressional oversight comes with this legislation, because Congress has to authorize
Even if there's congressional oversight, the office is making the final decision. So what stopped
no,
President Trump?
what happens is that Congress has to approve the
The
investigation.
questioning time has now elapsed. We will move to a negation cycle of debate. Senator Smith, do you have a motion?
I do. Motion to approach the chair with an amendment.
So the way that I would normally function through this is that you would send the, first of all, we have to do a 1/3 second to even see if an amendment wants to be considered by the chamber. So all senators, raise your placards.
Point of order.
Point of order.
Yes.
Yeah, so don't you have to hear the amendment first before you decide if you want to 1/3 second it?
My apologies. I thought you already sent it into the chat.
And then another point of order.
Yes.
So I was going to submit the amendment through the chat to the parley to rule germane or dilatory, then it would be announced, then it would have the 1/3 second.
That is great. My apologies. I thought you had already sent it through the chat.
No, thank you so much.
Senator Donaldson, that will actually be sent to you.
Okay,
You are more than welcome to consult with me regarding that amendment to determine whether it's germane or not, but that is actually your decision.
Awesome, wonderful. So I will look at that through the next negation speech and I will determine that afterwards. But for now, we're going to proceed with the debate. So all negative speakers, please raise your placards. That goes to Senator Zhao.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Joe, spelled Z-H-O-U. As always, I'm at the leisure of those above me, so any thumbs up or indication when you guys are ready.
And for everyone in the chamber, please correct me on pronunciation whenever it's necessary.
All right. I was a big fan of Schoolhouse Rock growing up. I loved the episodes on how a bill gets made and the idea of barter, but it seems that this Congress hasn't watched those episodes. It's time that this House gets schooled on how exactly today's legislation rocks the nation's trade. So first, let's talk about my favorite Schoolhouse Rock episode about trading, and let's see how trade is impacted by today's legislation. That's because today's legislation limits presidential credibility in trade talks. So forcing the USTR and the executive branch to seek approval from Congress with every trade action makes it difficult for foreign nations to actually trust the words of the president. William Hawk, associate professor of economics at the University of South Carolina, on July 9th of 2019 tells us that it is necessary to give the president credibility when negotiating agreements. If foreign counterparts believe that an agreement is likely to be bottled up or amended in Congress, they may be reluctant to make concessions. So when we push the responsibility from the trade representative and the president to Congress, we lose credibility in the international realm. Senator Khan tells us that when Senator Khan tells us that the Trump administration has actually decreased the US's GDP through his trade deals, that's not actually correct because his credibility in trade talks have bolstered the economy. Politico on August 27th of 2019 tells us that Trump's tough trade tactics and bellicose statements and tweets actually helped the United States reach a new trade deal with Canada and Mexico, a revised trade agreement with South Korea, and a potential mini agreement with Japan covering agriculture, autos, and digital trade. When you look at today's legislation, we need to recognize that despite all of his rash statements and mistakes, President Trump has still gotten helpful trade across in the international status quo. His presidential credibility has actually been a leverage to encourage positive trade for our economy. So when President Khan comes up here and tells us that our economy will be bolstered by today's legislation, that's not necessarily true because the congressional way of actually affirming the legislation that would allow us to go through with trade wouldn't actually be true. Affirming today's legislation removes presidential credibility and spurs distrust in further trade agreements. But now let's go to another one of my favorite Schoolhouse Rock episodes. It's the one about how a bill gets made. But we're senators, so we already know how a bill gets made. But let's analyze how our Congress's setup makes it harder to advocate for affirming today's legislation. That's directly because today's legislation subjects trade to polarization and partisanship of Congress. It should come as no surprise to us that Congress is extremely partisan, and it only threatens to get more and more partisan as time passes. Brookings in 2014 tells us that 75% of the salient issues on Washington's agenda are subject to legislative gridlock. As House and Senate chamber medians diverge in their policy views, legislative deadlock grows. If we affirm today's legislation, we greatly increase the chance that trade agreements are going to be bogged down in congressional gridlock. The impact of Senator Khan's legislation falls directly when we can't make any decisions at all as a Congress. We have to weigh the impacts here. Do we take any action by the executive office, or do we take no action because of legislative gridlock? Under today's legislation, we take no action, which is objectively worse. When we affirm today's legislation, our polarization and partisanship bog down our country's reliability for trade agreements in the international community. When repercussions are imperative, it's time that we negate. This legislation might just be a bill on Capitol Hill, but we negate.
For the judges, that was exactly 3 minutes and 10 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards. That goes to Senator Zhao, Tiffany Zhao.
Thanks. Hi, Senator. So just a simple question. Wouldn't you define presidential credibility as the president actually doing what he says he's going to do?
I would define presidential credibility as his status in the international community.
Sure. So in the status quo, under the power that Section 301 currently grants him, isn't he able to just constantly go back and forth on his decisions and trade policies? Isn't that going to be harming presidential credibility?
What we've seen is that his presidential credibility and his strong-handedness in the international community actually makes him very reliable when it comes to trade.
Really, you think it's reliable to go back and forth on a decision all the time?
I'm not necessarily talking about being.
Thank you, Senator Mehta.
Hey, so do you know around how many employees the USTR has right now?
I believe Senator Khan in his introduction said about 200, but I'm not too sure.
Yeah, so it used to be 265 before the government shutdown, but now they have about 70. Do you know how long it takes to like evaluate any exemption claims and basically like the workload that the individual employee needs to bear?
I'm sure you can tell me.
Yeah, it's around 2.5 hours per exemption. What makes you think that this Congress is even more backlogged than the ability of the USTR?
Hi, so you're worried about the president's ability to make trade deals, right?
Yes.
So do tariffs hurt or help trade?
So it depends. Tariffs can be a good way to like punish countries that have been up to like very bad practices in the international.
Right, but that's not necessarily going to encourage trade because it just blocks it. So why is congressional authority over those tariffs going to harm trade?
Because congressional authority means that we essentially go into so much partisan gridlock that it's impossible to make any decisions.
Thank you, Senator Smith.
Thank you, Senator. So I want to talk about your idea of bipartisanship. Who elects the U.S. Trade Representative?
So the U.S. Trade Representative is part of the president's cabinet.
Right. So who puts the people in the office under the U.S. Trade Representative?
The U.S. Trade Representative.
So is it fair to say that the U.S. Trade Representative and their office would be more partisan than a Congress, which has bipartisan clash and an open hearing once this legislation is
bipartisan? It's not bipartisan clash in the Congress. It's
Thank you,
direct
Senators.
partisan
The questioning time has now elapsed. Before we move on to another affirmative speech, I've decided to rule the amendment presented to me by Senator Smith germane because it does not change the intention of today's piece of legislation. That being said, I will read out what the amendment states. It goes, quote, change, quote, section 301 within section 1B, section 2A, section 2B, and section 4 to read section 301 to 310. That's the first part of it. Just giving everyone to write something down. Great. Then the second part of it is to change, quote, section 2B, harmonized trade schedule codes to harmonized tariff schedule codes. Does anyone in the chamber, would anyone like me to repeat the amendment? Seeing none, we will now do a 1/3 second to see if we can move forward. All senators who would like to consider today's amendment, raise your placards to the screen.
Point of inquiry before we do that. Will the amendments be voted on separately or as a pair?
Sorry, Senator Hurley, you can restate that.
Will the amendments be voted on independently or as a pair?
Right, they're together. So we're going to vote on how it's changing the bill all at once. Great. Senator Ranjan, did you have a motion? Great. We will proceed with the vote. So we're going to have all seconds to consider today's amendment. Raise your placard to the screen. All opposed. Great. So unfortunately, Senator Smith, today's amendment will not be considered. That being said, we will continue on the flow of debate on an affirmative cycle speech. All speakers, raise your placard to the screen. Senator Farage.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Farage, spelled F-A-R-A-J. Can I please get an indication held up so I can make sure I get all of our judges over here? Okay, I see one.
And I'm always ready for the chamber.
Okay, I see my second judge and my final judge. Awesome, thank you so much. And I'm also using my phone as a personal timer, if that is all right. When I think of tariffs, I don't think about the dictators or prime ministers or presidents of other countries. I think about the American family struggling to get by, who now has to pay even more money just to fill up their gas tank or buy food for their children. Tariffs affect the lives of our country's most vulnerable, and we tend to use them just too often. But passing today's legislation finally rewrites that narrative. Now, Representative Khan did a great job in his sponsorship speech of explaining the impact that tariffs have on employment. But let's realize how much tariffs actually cost Americans annually. A report by David Turek of the National Foundation for American Policy finds in September of 2019 that on an annual basis, the cost of tariffs to consumers is around $259.2 billion, costing the average household around $2,000 per year. Basic necessities, almost as if overnight, can increase in cost drastically. Household appliances necessary for families to function have become excessively expensive, forcing Americans to either go without them or pay egregious prices. This is absolutely unnecessary. But when we pass this legislation, we ensure that one person's impulsive decision doesn't affect the 330 million constituents that we serve. But next, Representative Zhao tells us that after we pass this legislation, we will implement fewer tariffs. And he tries to tell us that that's a bad thing. But I actually think that passing fewer tariffs makes them much more effective. A May 2019 report by Emily Loftus of the University of Nebraska explains that if Congress were to take back our tariff power, then the United States could see a decrease in tariffs and a lower threat of trade wars in the near future. Having more oversight over the implementation of tariffs ensures that every single economic action that we take is well thought out and reflects the best interests of the American people. But finally, a March 2019 report published in the European Central Bank Update on Economic and Monetary Development finds through an analysis of protectionism inside the United States and inside China that using tariffs in moderation had the most positive economic impact because it caused small levels of economic repercussions on the target country without heavily discouraging domestic investment. Representative Zhu is right in questioning. Tariffs can be good when they're used in moderation. Passing today's legislation stops us from just making mindless financial decisions. We can finally ensure that every single tariff we implement is the most effective that it can be, so that our country doesn't face economic downfall. At the end of today's debate, we are going to have to judge it on what is best for the American people we represent. Pass this legislation.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 2 seconds. All questioners, please raise your placards. That goes to Senator Hurley.
I didn't have my placard up. I apologize.
Let's just make sure we're really clear about that. That goes to Senator Zhou.
So in the status quo, have retaliatory tariffs been valuable under the Trump administration?
Well, okay, here's the thing. When we use retaliatory tariffs way too often, they actually hurt Americans and decrease investment inside America.
How often have they been occurring in the status quo?
They've been occurring fairly often over the last 4 years.
Okay, but have they been punitive or have they been for no reason at all?
They've been punitive, but what I'm saying is they're not actually effective on those countries if they're hurting the United States more than the countries we're trying to.
Okay, moving on. So what's more valuable, no tariffs at all or some tariffs?
I'm saying tariffs in moderation. That's what happens when you give Congress the power to deliberate.
Thank you. Hi, Ms. Farage. So what's the intention of this legislation? Is it to increase or decrease tariffs, or is it to transfer power from one branch of the government to the other?
It transfers the power, and in doing so, it decreases the amount of tariffs because there's more deliberation within Congress.
Okay, so if the office in Section 2A is making the final decision, what's the guarantee that President Trump just doesn't lobby the Office of Trade to pass his policies that are favorable?
No, here's the thing. When the Congress is given that power, we're able to deliberate. And now the USTR is actually advising us.
But if his office is making the final decision,
has now elapsed.
I think the chair.
To a negation cycle of debate. All negative speakers, raise your placards to the screen. Senator Bendock.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. If the judges could just give me a thumbs up when you're ready, that would be perfect. Awesome, great. Awesome. One sec, just let me pin the PO. I'll be good. When our founding fathers created the Constitution with a system of checks and balances in mind, they did so not only to legislate for presidents then, but for presidents now. But because this bill fails to adequately limit the executive power for a president that decides to listen or not to listen to this Congress, we have no choice but to fail this bill. First, fail this bill because it lacks any solvency in the case of a rogue president. The scope of this debate has been limited to a president's usage of Section 301 retaliatory measures, but understand that closing that door only opens a more dangerous one. Representative Khan and Farage has operated under the assumption that President Trump used Section 301 tariffs. That is categorically false. According to Reuters on November 19th of last year, President Trump didn't even use Section 301 to start the trade war. He used Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This is only a precursor of what come presidents. Without being able to turn to the Trade Act of 1974, as this legislation suggests, they have a multitude of other options, not just Section 232, but the International Emergency Powers Act of 1977. Benjamin Coates explains for the Journal of Modern American History in July of 2018 that a rogue president can do this when presented with no other option. The Supreme Court case INS versus Chanda in 1983 found that a legislative veto by this Congress limits our ability to prove that the president is unconstitutional when he takes this measure. Understand that this ruling takes away any limitation on executive discretion. We have no checks and balances when it comes to any other types of tariffs. Representative Khan, either way, a rogue president erodes our international credibility. And Representative Farage, your concerns of tariffs occur whether you pass or fail this piece of legislation. Because if a president wants to invoke another type of tariff, he or she can do so. At this point, the affirmation no longer has any ground in today's debate because our concerns are not limited to Section 301 tariffs. But let me give you a reason to actively fail this bill, because it limits our ability to negotiate with other countries. Representative Khan and Farage have operated under the assumption that Section 301 only implements tariffs. This is a half-truth that leaves us blindsided if we pass this piece of legislation, because Section 301 is also used to negotiate before we implement tariffs. According to a report by the Congressional Research Service 2 years ago, depending on the case, from supply chain distribution to intellectual property right violations, the USTR takes between 12 and 18 months in most cases to resolve unfair trade practices and before they even retaliate. This time frame is important because since 1974, the World Trade Organization reports that we've solved 104 cases this way before even implementing tariffs. But passing this bill, Representative Farage, will lead to even more tariffs because we have less time to make trade agreements. Because look at Section 2A of this bill, which says that the USTR has to make a decision within 45 days instead of the 545 days they have right now. This legislation only increases tariffs and decreases the limits on executive power. Please fail this bill.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 9 seconds. All questioners, hold your placards to the screen. That goes to Senator Ranjan.
Hi, Senator. Why is it better to have this power within one person as opposed to a multitude of people?
Well, I think either way, that if one person has it, which is the president, it's not just one person, they have other options.
Okay, but the president, but the USTR is going to make a retaliatory launch investigation based off the guidance of the president. So if the president doesn't like a country, for example, like Mexico, what stops him from making that tariff?
Actually, no. The president listens to the USTR. It's not the other way around. The USTR recommends tariffs to the president.
The USTR is under the guidance of the president. He's been elected by the president. He's going to do everything.
Was that me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Did President Trump use Section 301 at all when he was inflicting tariffs on China?
For the investigations, not the tariffs. My speech is focused on the tariffs
themselves. On net,
themselves.
President Trump used these tariffs. Why is it not a good thing to check at least some of his power, even though it's not all of its power?
Well, I agree that checking some of his power would be good, but my entire second point is about how checking this power by limiting the amount of time this Congress has to make a decision by 45 days limits our ability to stop tariffs from occurring in the first place.
But then you just contradicted yourself. Is checking his power good or bad?
not in the way that this legislation does. That was my entire second
Thank you,
point.
speakers. The questioning time has now elapsed. We will move back to an affirmative cycle of debate. All speakers, raise your placards. That goes to Senator Joel.
I thank the chair. That's Senator Joel speaking for the first time this legislative session. Joel. I'm at the leisure of those above me, so give me an indication when you're ready. Famous rapper / producer Kanye West once stated that no one man should have all that power. And while only Kanye thinks Kanye should be a founding father, that statement serves as the backbone of our democracy and the reason why I'm supporting this legislation today. First, pass to restore legitimacy to this Congress. Now, Senator Zhao is worried that this legislation will undermine the president's legitimacy in trade negotiations. But what he fails to realize is how infrequently Section 301 was exercised before this administration. According to the National Law Review, while Section 301 lay dormant for 2 decades, President Trump recently utilized the authority to tariff China and India without congressional oversight. Senator Bendock claims that rogue presidents can rely on the IEEPA to tariff countries. But the Brennan Center for Justice finds in 2019 that the IEEPA was only used once by President Trump to impose tariffs on Mexico. That was the first time it was ever invoked for tariffs, and it was illegal, and he receives substantial backlash from his party. In giving the president unilateral authority to issue tariffs, Section 301 undermines the authority of this Congress. Dan Griswold of the GMU's Mercatus Institute explains that President Trump's trade policy is the latest illustration that the power of the presidency has grown at the expense of this Congress. The most lasting consequence of his tariff war will be the subversion of Congress's constitutional authority over trade. But second, pass to strengthen our position in the WTO. Section 301 does not require that the president wait until he receives authorization from the WTO to take action, despite the fact that we have committed ourselves to do so. But international studies expert Aaron Dunn explains that as the US refuses to engage in WTO dispute resolution mechanisms, its legitimacy in the organization wanes. Consequently, China is playing an active role in giving itself greater clout in WTO proceedings. I disagree with Senator Khan. China won't abandon the WTO with us, but instead see our actions as an opening to reshape the WTO to fit its own interests. Gaining more sway inside of the WTO will allow China to gain the mantle of global trade leadership that President Xi Jinping desires. This would be a frontal assault on our leadership in a liberal international order, with a variety of severe consequences for our economy and business environment. For instance, China has argued for decreasing international property norms, and allowing China to dictate norms on intellectual property is antithetical to US interests, as the Hill quantifies that IP theft costs America $600 million a year, as well as 2 million American jobs. Ultimately, this bill takes the power out of the hands of a unitary actor and into the hands of this Congress, a body that is far more representative of this country. The balance between legislature and the executive in the US can be restored and sustained by voting to pass today's legislation.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 2 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards. That goes to Senator Bogo.
Okay, so let's look at the investigation with China a few years ago, right? Did the USTR actually talk to like the WTO and sign something regarding China and breaking like illegal contracts?
Yeah. So essentially, the Trump administration has used Section 301 as an excuse not to go to the WTO, decreasing our institutional legitimacy.
Did we go to the WTO in 2018? Did USTR go to the WTO?
Yes, but we actually imposed 301 outside of the WTO without actually interacting with their dispute
Thank you, Senator Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Can you tell me and explain to me exactly what harmonized trade schedule codes as seen in Section 2B are?
What's the point of the question? Like, it's in the legislation. We understand it. The question doesn't go anywhere.
Harmonized trade schedule codes do not exist. There are only harmonized tariff schedule codes. So why are you advocating to pass a piece of legislation with words and phrases that do not exist in any US code?
Look, we can amend the legislation if you want.
The questioning time has now elapsed. Yes, that's granted, Senator Khan. We will move back to a negative cycle of debate. All speakers, raise your placards. Senator Jauvery.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Representative Javeri. That's spelled Jhaveri for my judges. There's a little bit of thunder going outside, so if there's any small minor distraction, sorry about that. But just let me know when you're ready. Any indication, thumbs up, nod, smile, and I'll be happy to begin. Good here. Second judge is good, and my last judge is good. Great. In a tweet last October, in an attempt to demonstrate his political prowess, President Trump directly tweeted at the Turkish Prime Minister, stating, quote, "I, in my great and unmatched wisdom, will totally destroy and obliterate the entire Turkish economy." It's safe to say that when a president with such trigger-happy tweets and the mindset of President Trump doesn't mean necessarily dictate that our trade policies are going to be in the right hands. So first, fail today's piece of legislation because it limits time to decide on evaluations and exclusions. Thus far, nobody has talked about this vast important point that occurs in Section 2A of this legislation. So allow me to explain. When tariffs are originally implemented, companies have the option to file for exclusion requests with the United States Trade Representatives, allowing them to be exempt from these harmful tariffs. For example, if President Trump were to place tariffs on China on the steel industry, then a steel manufacturing company in Michigan would have the option of applying for an exclusion to this tariff because they believe that it hurts not only their industry, but also their company. The problem is, as the Peterson Institute for Economic Analysis explains on December 19th of 2019, that the USTR, or the United States Trade Representatives, is extremely overburdened with such requests, toppling over $34 billion in exemption requests that they take every single year. But nobody thus far has made the delineation between how long this legislation gives us to make those decisions versus how we are doing that in the status quo. Allow me to be the first. In 2018, trade exemptions took almost a year to process all of the $34 billion of exclusion requests that were processed. But under Section 2A of this legislation, we are only given 45 days. That's compressing the amount of time that's given to the US Office of Trade Representatives by over 90% to make these decisions. The reason why that's so important is because those companies who have lower wages and lower costs, who need exclusions, can't apply for them if we're continuously compressing the time. And if the United States Trade Representatives House doesn't have the time they need to delineate between the two, we're going to be losing on thousands of jobs. But second, let's understand the negation today, the affirmation, and understand why the negation wins this debate. Mr. Khan and Ms. Farage start off this debate by explaining that the Trump administration is going to place unilateral sanctions on different countries. But the framework of this debate has shifted away from the tenet of the legislation, which is actually about preserving and changing the status quo from a unilateral presidency to a congressional jurisdiction. But the reason why this is problematic is because it's outlined in Section 1, in Section 2B, that the president is going to continue to have the final decision on matters. Because this trade administration is spearheaded by the president, he has the unilateral authority to dictate what they do, when they do it, and how they do it. That's why any sort of policy passed by the president, even after congressional approval, is dictated by Congress. At the end of the day, whether it be Trump's trigger-happy tweets or our policies, it's finally time for reform, and that comes by negating.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards. Senator Farage.
Hi, Senator. Can you tell me what the purpose of that 45-day deadline is?
Yeah, it's to allow the office to make a decision on how many exclusions are going to be committed.
Yeah, so Senator Zhao on your own side is concerned that this Congress can't make a decision quickly. Why is it bad if we're encouraging this Congress to make quick decisions?
That's not actually the case. Since 2018, we've had over $34 billion of...
Okay, you told me that. I listened to your speech. But why is it bad if we're giving this deadline so that Congress can act quickly?
The reason why the deadline exists in the first place is to allow these companies to apply.
Senator Tang.
Do you know why we have this part in the legislation with harmonized trade codes?
So I know it's to switch out between which goods are, because each good has a trade code. So when you switch out the trade code, you have to switch the number on the goods.
The reason why we put that in was because that allows us to give exclusions. And that doesn't have the 45 time limit, doesn't it?
No, but companies still have to comply under a certain amount of time, even though in 2018 it took over a year for
We
these companies
passed them.
to
The
make
office
decisions.
can still have the exclusions, right? Because
Representative
we're
Tang,
not
it took
competitive.
over a year for us to make these decisions on $35 billion
Thank
of
you,
goods
Speaker. The
specifically.
question period has now elapsed.
Thank
We
the
will
chair.
move back to an affirmative cycle of debate. All speakers, raise your placards. Senator Mehta.
I thank the chair. Hello, everyone. I'm just setting up a quick timer. And judges, if you could please give me any indication when you're ready, I'd appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Great. And is my volume okay? Awesome. Look at us. Look at us here today. With our fancy suits, expensive laptops, and abundant opportunities, not everyone in our country gets to live like we do. And I think that it's important that with legislation like what we have today, we remember to check our privilege and understand the true beneficiaries of legislation that we pass. At the end of the day, when we pass trade tariffs or any sort of trade policy, we are not the ones who are impacted. It's our low-income constituents, those who need the most amount of help. And it's because passing today's bill helps those very people, especially in the face of a global pandemic. Stand with me and pass today's legislation. So first, pass today's legislation because the USTR in all fronts is inherently ineffective. And this is true because the USTR has a very limited set of response options. Now, from the very beginning of today's debate, Senators Khan and Farage have done a great job explaining exactly what the repercussions of passing exorbitant tariffs are, which obviously the USTR has done. But no one's exactly explained why this Congress won't go about imposing an agenda similar to the USTR. The Congressional Research Service furthers this idea when they state on January 27th of 2020 that the USTR must give preference to duties, for example, tariffs, if the action is taken in the form of any terms agreed to a Section 301 agreement, such as import rates. Essentially, what the 301 clause does is corners us into a specific area of foreign policy, not allowing us to implement any further actions unless we first prefer tariffs. That the effects of this can be seen in the trade war and the impacts. But Senator Bendock brings up the only real response from the negation when he talks about within the Trump administration not only utilizing Section 301, but 232 of the Trade Expansion Act as well to impose his own agenda. But that doesn't render this bill useless because Section 301 uniquely covers both tariff and non-tariff retaliations. This is one of the most critical impacts in today's round. Section 232 doesn't cover non-tariff related negotiations. By non-tariff, I mean completely withdrawing and suspending trade agreements, like pulling out of the TPP. Those are protected if we pass today's legislation. But I think it's pretty interesting that Senator Zhao mentions Trump's positive trade accomplishments, because in one of the most precarious times in our history, he hasn't been able to act, because these unilateral tariffs are contributing to our quickly depleting medical supply in the face of COVID-19. And this is true because despite emergency circumstances, the federal government is still rejecting many tariff exemption requests for critical medical supplies, furthered by Eric Boehm from Reason in March 27th of 2020, saying that the federal government simply keeps rejecting requests from different industries, like the industry that makes Purell hand sanitizer, to exempt them from the 25% tariffs. But that's because, like Senator Javeri brought up, the entire department is so overburdened. But why? Because as I brought up with Senator Zhao in cross-examination, 75% of USTR employees have been furloughed. If we want to take adequate action during this time, we're going to actually pass today's legislation and make sure that our people have access to the
That was a speech of 3 minutes and 15 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards. Senator Bendock.
Thank you. So we both agree that tariffs in excess are only the U.S. are 45 days to negotiate with another country before retaliating.
So you cut off a little bit, but I think what your question is about the 45-day period. And I think that that's still like, well, first of all, I think that your point about the 232 part like just kind of falls void because it just like doesn't make sense because it doesn't cover non-tariff related exemptions. In regards to specifically tariff related exemptions, the 45-day period is like more than sufficient.
But if they take 12 to 18 months in set.
Hi, Representative. What actually gives the president the power of tariff levying?
these acts.
Okay, what is the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917?
Why don't you tell me?
It allows the president to impose a tariff during a time of war. What does Section 2C of today's legislation do?
Doesn't allow him to do that.
What does Section 2C of today's legislation do?
Yeah, it does not allow him to do that.
Exactly. It places an exemption if there's an AOMF. So what's the
Thank you,
purpose?
speakers. The questioning period has now elapsed. We will return to a negation cycle of debate.
Before we call on the next speaker, if there is an issue during questioning where we cannot hear the speaker, can you please freeze the time in questioning and have that individual repeat the question so that we can make sure that all of the judges heard it?
Yes, absolutely. I didn't know if that was in the guidelines. I'm happy to do that.
I think it would just be helpful, and we want to make sure that everyone can hear the questions, just
Wonderful.
because it was a significant issue.
Great, I'm happy to do that for future questioners.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, again, all negation speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Smith.
I thank the chair. I am Senator Smith. I'll begin with any indication from PO Parlian judges. Good. And then second judge, are we good? I can't tell if your video is frozen or if you are not moving. Perfect, thank you so much. Upon passage, the Trade Act of 1974 made all trade between the United States and foreign nations crystal clear. For example, Section 301 of the Act clarifies the definition of commerce and workers' rights. Section 305 contains information and intellectual property rights. And Section 310 outlines how an investigation and subsequent retaliatory action should be taken place. This piece of legislation has the best of intentions, and I agree with the affirmation's impacts if this piece of legislation wasn't so riddled with typos and errors that upon passage, no changes in our legislation would have any effect. One of the most important arguments that the affirmation presented to you today is talking about the deliberations from 30 to 45 days. Currently, under the US Trade Act, it says that under Section 304A2AI of the Trade Act, they are 30 days for deliberations. And Senator Mayrod just came up here to talk to you about how since the USTR has had its staff lowered by 75%, it is absolutely necessary to have that extended period of time. The issue with that piece of legislation, though, is when and if we affirm today's legislation and pass it, it is not changing anything, because every place where it says Section 301 investigation or Section 301 retaliatory action needs to be replaced with 301 to 310 and Section 1B, 2A, 2B, Section 4. They all contain errors that would entirely prevent this legislation from having any effect if passed. All of the affirmations arguments fall entirely on their butts if this deadlock is not rectified. If you are asking to find a solution within Section 301, but it exists in Section 305 to 310 of the US Trade Act, we passed today's legislation, there's no solvency within Section 301. None of the affirmations' positive impacts will come to fruition. Second, we fail because in Section 2B's harmonized trade schedule codes, they do not exist. I asked Senator Joel about this during questioning, and he said, well, we could pass an amendment to fix that change. That is the amendment that I proposed. The author meant to write harmonized tariff schedule codes. These are the 6 to 10 digit classifications of items put onto lists for tariffs. When one classification is being taxed at a certain rate, all items from that region are taxed and identified with a similar rate of goods. We need to fix that error, changing trade to tariff before anything can happen. Harmonized trade schedule codes do not exist. Any retaliatory action is not found within Section 301. It's within 305 to 310. So passing this legislation would have no effect, leaving our only options today to amend or to fail. Now, the positive actions, if the affirmation after we amend this legislation, it's the only way we can fix it. That's why we must either fail or amend the legislation presented to you today.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 4 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards. That goes to Senator Khan.
Hi, so I just read over the US Code of Section 301, and it specifically says that that is the section that gives the USTR ability to retaliate. So why wouldn't this legislation still work?
So That's a very common misconception. If you actually go into the Trade Act of 1974, read sections 301 to 310. 301 is defining commerce and workers' rights. 302, like they go down the list.
Right. But 301 still gives the USTR the executive ability to do so. So why wouldn't passing still solve the issue?
No,
because regardless of whether 305 or 310 exists, 301 still has limitations.
Thank you. That goes to Senator Mehta.
Hey, so can you read me the title of this bill?
The title of this legislation does not have any effect on the legislation written under it.
But why not? It does say a bill to reform sections 301 to 310 of the Trade Act of 1974.
All the time with funky names and cool acronyms that has absolutely no.
But it's like common knowledge, and even says by like the government department that sections 301 to 310 are often referred to as just 301 because it's implementation.
Thank you, speakers. The questioning time has now elapsed. We will return to an affirmative cycle of debate. But first, Senator Khan, with a motion.
I move to submit an amendment.
I will take that in the chat box and I will look through that over the next speech. I love all this amendment activity today. So exciting. Okay, I will do that first. And then Senator Smith, do you have a motion?
I do. I have a motion to reconsider the tabled motion to amend.
Wonderful. Since we will take both of those in the chat and I will look at both of those again and we will do that after our next speech. Senator Smith.
The motion to reconsider is a second and a majority vote.
Okay, I was going to proceed and then do both of them together, but if we would like to do that now, that's fine. All seconds on the re-proposed amendment, raise your placards.
Wait, point of inquiry.
Senator Bendock.
Since that amendment failed to be considered in the first place, don't we have to reconsider both amendments at the same time?
Right, that was my original point. However, I think that was clearly not what the chamber wanted to do. I'm going to go with my original intent. Senator Smith, we will do this after our next speech so I can look at both of them. We'll present it again after that. Wonderful. Moving forward, all affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Hurley.
That is Senator Jonathan Hurley speaking for the first time this session, first time today. If my judges could just give me a sign of life and we'll get going, I would greatly appreciate it. Today's debate has been far too centric on economic impacts and not on our general position in the international community. And it is because I believe this piece of legislation would fundamentally change that and bolster our position with regards to the World Trade Organization that I affirm. Now, first off, I want to go back and explain exactly what this bill does, despite Senator Smith's claims. Section 1, subsection A, takes the power of the U.S. Trade Representative to unilaterally act away because subparagraph D, as referenced, reads that is what empowers the trade representative to unilaterally enact an investigation, despite Senator Smith's claims. Now, let's move into exactly what that would do, in contrast to what Senator Zhao highlighted earlier, saying that this would diminish the United States' strength as it pertains to trade negotiations. That's true, but not entirely, because as Politico reported in March 2017, most of our trade partners have started to take action to work with other world powers and move away from us, such as Senator Joel referenced earlier with China, because of the fact President Trump and his appointees' abilities to hastily, willfully stifle international exchange through the use of Section 301 and its investigative powers. While this legislation might slow down the process, and in all honesty is likely to do so, whenever we aren't moving as quickly in trade disputes and due to partisanship, as Senator Zhao brought up earlier, it restores the legitimacy of the World Trade Organization, a point that was only briefly mentioned in regards to China's strength by Senator Joel. The World Trade Organization would be greatly empowered by this legislation, as we would no longer be unilaterally constantly acting to essentially circumvent their ability to do their job, which is to regulate approximately 98% of global trade and trillions of dollars in economic exchange. Columbia's Business School published a piece in 2008 that analyzed the fundamental functions of the WTO and found its primary benefit was rather simple. It forced nations to work together and play by the same set of rules, and has been consistently undermined by the Trade Act of 1974 through usage of Section 301, subparagraph D. Whenever we empower the World Trade Organization, as this piece of legislation would do, it helps weaken the trade barriers and the impact of the sanctions that have been brought up time and time again on the affirmation, such as by Senator Farage. This was proven further by a Washington Post article from September 2016, which stipulated that whenever we worked with the World Trade Organization directly, it boosted our relationship with Asian countries like Japan. Now, Senator Boondock tried to claim this legislation would limit our ability to work solo and hurt international cooperation, but that couldn't be further from the truth, as was highlighted by the Washington Post, by that same Washington Post article, which said that the WTO tends to side with us in disputes and gives those decisions legitimacy. China hasn't been able to move in yet, and this legislation will completely prevent their ability to do so. What we're going to do is shift our foreign policy to be focused on working with the WTO and to improve international cooperation. We're going to strengthen them and our relations around the world by affirming.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 5 seconds. All questioners, raise your placard to the screen. That goes to Senator Zhao, Alex Zhao.
So usually trade repercussions need to be introduced quickly in order to have their intended effect, right?
See, the only issue with that stipulation is that throughout this debate, it's been proven that that's not what's happening.
So
There's
if China conducts
backlogs to get anything done.
It conducts an egregious intellectual property violation, do we need to move quickly or slowly in order to make sure that
this just sets a cap that you can't take more than 45 days to move compared to the years-long backlog?
If our Congress shuffles our feet for 45 days compared to the USTR making a decision in 1 day, which is more effective?
The fact of the matter is they have such a backlog, they're not going to be able to move in a day unilaterally.
Senator Bendock.
Thank you. How effective has the WTO been in our dispute with China?
See, the issue with that entire preposition is that the reason they haven't been able to be effective is because they don't have the power to do so because we keep overstepping our bounds despite our—
Why not? We've gone to the WTO 9 times with regards to China. They didn't do anything. How is it effective?
See, let me elaborate. So essentially the issue there is the WTO struggles with regards to the fact that we keep counteracting. They struggle to have legitimacy.
Thank you, Speaker. The questioning time has now elapsed. We will reconsider and go through a couple of amendments that have been proposed. First, Senator Khan proposes an amendment to us that was different from the previous amendment because it's 1/2 instead of both together. So Senator Khan proposes, let me just pull it up real quick. He proposes, and everyone can write this down if this is helpful, to amend section 2B to say, quote, harmonized trade schedule codes and to harmonized tariff schedule codes. That was 1/2 of the previous amendment, but it's different because it did not contain both of the previous halves. So we will do that one first. Seconds on Senator Khan's amendment. Raise your placards to the screen. And leave them on the screen just so I can count to make sure we have 1/3. That is definitely 1/3 of the room. So that one, now we will vote on that amendment since it has been seconded. All those who wish to pass Senator Khan's amendment, raise your placards. Yes.
You need to open debate on that piece of amendment, and then we're going to motion to move previous question. That's when you have the 2/3 majority and then the major to pass or fail.
Right, that's wonderful. If you could just give me 1 second, because I was also going to do yours before we move any forward so we know which one we're doing. So I was just going to propose yours again since it was already in the box.
Let's do one amendment at a time.
Okay, wonderful. Not
Motion
used to this many amendments in one round. This is wonderful. Senator Bendock,
to move to previous question on Senator Khan's amendment.
any seconds?
Second.
Any opposed? Wonderful. We'll move to previous question on that. All those who wish to, or we will open the floor for debate on that amendment, seeing as that is what we, sorry. We need to vote first. All those who wish to pass today's amendment, Senator Khan's amendment, raise your placard. And keep it there because we have people rising. Okay, that is majority. That amendment has passed. Seeing as we just did that one, I'm assuming everyone now, we will go to the second amendment before we move forward since that one was automatically passed. So Senator Smith's amendment was the same one as before, but re-proposed, which includes also changing the sections with 301 to 305, the one you should already have it written down. It involved both. So all those who wish to second that amendment, raise your placard. All opposed? Wonderful. The majority is opposed. Since this is a reproposed amendment 2 times, I encourage the entire chamber to keep amendments to a minimum so we can continue with speeches. That being said, Senator Khan's amendment is now in place, so we would consider with debate in the original order. All negation speakers, raise your placards. That goes to Senator Boco.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Boco, spelled B-O-K-L for the judges. So everyone is really laggy right now because it's thundering outside. So if you can let me know if you can't hear me or if I stop in the middle of my speech, then that would be great. And we could fix that somehow, hopefully. But please just let me know whenever you're ready. Okay, awesome. From acting decades younger than one's age to being obsessed with the color hot pink, my strange addiction has seen it all. Now, if the United States joined the show, then our strange obsession would be described by one word: China. So let's do something that this Congress hasn't, and let's use our strange obsession with China to actually look at historical precedent and understand why we have to negate. The first reason why you're principally going to negate this piece of legislation is because the USTR is independently functional. Now, Representative Khan starts off today's debate by stating that the USTR has their own jurisdiction regarding investigations and only works with the executive branch. And Representative Mehta follows that by saying that the USTR doesn't have enough resources, which is why the Congress needs to be involved. But these couldn't be farther from the truth. Pay attention to the New York Times on April 2nd of 2018, where they explained that USTR held a public hearing on October 10th of 2017 regarding the investigation with China, where they consulted with private sector advisory committees, held 2 rounds of public comment periods, and received approximately 70 written submissions from trade unions, US workers, academics, think tanks, and law firms. Why is this important? This essentially shows that the USTR isn't working alone or isn't working with the executive branch. Instead, it's working with a lot of companies to actually get information for the investigation. Through this consultation, they were able to finally use joint venture requirements, foreign investment restrictions, and administrative review and licensing processes that actually pressure technology transfer from US companies, and we were able to make some type of movement. Now, Representative Joel and Hurley have brought up the idea that we need to pass today's legislation because we need to get involved with the WTO. But pay attention to the question I've repeatedly been asking. In 2017 and 2018, the USTR did go to the WTO, regardless of what the Trump administration says. The USTR has our best interest at heart. So why does passing this legislation hurt that? Well, when you pass today's legislation, you spoil the effects of USTR or their efforts. When you bring bureaucratic approval, as explained by the Washington Post in January 3rd of 2019, you have to go through a lot of processes to even get investigation in the first place. This reduces the rate of intelligence by making the process 80 times slower, as the Journal of Law and Economics claims. The Federal of American Scientists in 2018 explains investigations made by US governmental organizations is essential to intelligence for the executive branch. But now let's talk about the controversy versus Section 301 and Section 232. The affirmation says we need to stop Trump some way. The problem is if we pass this legislation, all we're doing is we're removing everything from Section 301 and we're just going to push him towards Section 232. All of these problems are going to get exacerbated. At the end of the day, the most dangerous pair is power and ignorance. You stand with me and you negate.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 8 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards. That goes to Senator Ranjan.
Hi, Senator. So who actually appoints this U.S. trade representative?
Okay, so although Trump does appoint the U.S.
Exactly.
representative,
Just one second.
I'm proving to you that that doesn't matter because the USTR has gone against Trump in the past.
But despite these public hearings, we've known that tariffs hurt our American people. Why do we still impose tariffs? The public hearings are happening.
Those tariffs were imposed by 232. The ones that actually
No.
yes.
The Trump trade war has been happening with 232 and 301 because he's acting under the guidance of the president.
So then when you remove 301, you just push him more towards 232.
Why? Why does that happen?
Senator
They're
Jones.
used for different things.
Thank you for your speech, Senator. So how are 232 and 301 fundamentally different?
Okay, so section 301 actually provides some sort of checks and balances system because you have the UTSR.
No.
Yes, it does. Yes, it
Do you
does.
mind if I explain? So
Yeah.
section 232 is contingent on national security, which is a much higher burden than section 301, which is only contingent on unfair trade
I
practices.
have a card on this which explains that 58% of the tariffs that were under 232 were not actual threats to national security. The problem is no one is actually checking over.
Then that's a job for this Congress to check. So we can do that in subsequent legislation.
Questioning period has now elapsed. We will move back to an affirmative cycle of debate. All speakers raise your placards. Senator Zhao, Tiffany Zhao.
I thank the chair. Hi, this is Senator Zhao, spelled Z-H-A-O, so a little differently from the previous senator. It might be a little confusing. That's A-O. If it's all right with the judges, I'm gonna do this speech standing. So just let me know if they're okay with that. Cool, great. Thank you so much. As always, a smile or nod from you guys whenever you're ready would be fantastic. Cool, great, awesome. Thank you. Sign up to find a rancher, animal lover, or anyone down to earth. That's the pitch from dating site farmersonly.com. Because according to company spokesperson Jerry Miller, city folks just don't get it. Unfortunately, the disparity between farmers and city folks is not only just applicable to dating, but in fact is representative of a broader trend in the United States. And that's the increasing gap in distance between the working class and white collar workers. Unfortunately, CNBC reports in May of last year that retaliatory tariffs hurt the working class the most and at every angle. Stand with me today and affirm today's legislation to finally do the right thing and stand by every single American. Affirm. The first reason why we have to affirm today's legislation is because the answer to one of the most contentious questions in today's debate, which is, will today's legislation actually lead to the best trade policy possible? And the answer to that question is yes, and here's why. And that's because today's legislation incentivizes the executive and pushes them towards implementing non-retaliatory trade measures, which have been empirically proven to be the most effective trade measure. That's because, contrary to what Senator Smith may think, Section 1 does effectively do something. Section 1 no longer allows the USTR to take unilateral retaliatory action, but still does allow it to remove tariffs and other trade barriers, which is the best trade measure possible. Let's look at the facts to settle this for once and for all. Let's turn to the Market Watch in January of 2020, which explains that Beijing agreed to significantly increase its purchases of US products. China is now to buy $40 billion a year in US farm products. But this only happened under the Phase 1 agreement, where Trump actually agreed to drop plans to impose tariffs on an additional $160 billion in Chinese imports and halved existing tariffs on $110 billion of goods from China. Clearly, China was willing to come to a trade deal so long as there was proof that Trump would actually remove his tariffs. And when he actually did, we actually came to an effective trade deal. So clearly, Senator Zhou on the negation, the first negative speaker in today's debate, effective non-retaliatory trade measures far outweighs presidential credibility, because at the end of the day, presidential credibility doesn't matter when we're implementing the right trade policy for our American constituents. But next, let's talk about more on the topic of presidential credibility. In the status quo, presidential credibility is actually much worse, because in the status quo, the Section 301 allows the executive to go back and forth on his to unilaterally go back and forth in his trade decisions. However, today's legislation prevents that. But what's the actual harm in the uncertainty and the chaos that Trump causes in going back and forth in his trade policies? As the reason explains, in November of 2019, a spokesman for the Chinese Commerce Ministry said both countries had agreed to a reduction in tariffs, but Trump told reporters over the weekend that he had not agreed to any such decision, showing his uncertainty. And the harm in this is explained by New York Times in December of 2019. The uncertainty that Trumpian tariff policy is creating is giving businesses a strong incentive to postpone any plans they might have for building new factories and adding jobs. Passing this legislation will ensure our executive branch always makes the right trade policy decision and does so without causing chaos and uncertainty, which ultimately is going to help our businesses, our workers, and our American constituents. Pass.
With the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. All questioners, please raise your placards. That goes to Senator Smith.
Thank you, Chair. So can we settle this once and for all, please? If you look under Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act and search the words anywhere within 301 for the words executive, the words investigate, investigation, retaliate, retaliatory, they do not appear in the Trade Act under Section 301. How can we pass legislation specifically saying we need to use 301?
I'm just going to answer this with one simple answer. Senator Khan has already alluded to you that the exact wording of 301 gives the USTR the ability to implement retaliatory tariffs.
Words are within 301.
He had the text right in front of him. It's there.
Thank you,
I'm sorry.
Senator Javri.
Thank you. Hi, Ms. Zhao. So you, like a lot of other affirmation speakers, bring up this idea of retaliatory tariffs. So you would agree with me that these retaliatory tariffs hurt mostly like steel and manufacturing industries because that's where the tariffs are, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so if I explain to you in my speech that because exclusion rates, times where people can't even apply under the 45-day limit is so high, how would we ever be able to get these companies out of the despair?
Think about it like this way, Senator. If we pass today's...
The questioning period has now elapsed.
Sorry.
Well, no, that's okay. We'll move back to a negation cycle of debate. All speakers, raise your placards. Any and all speakers on the negation. And yes, Senator Hurley, you can take a point of personal privilege. Seeing none, or is that a speech, Senator Zhao?
That's a motion.
A motion?
To move to previous questioning.
Any seconds? Seeing no, is that a second, Senator Smith? Any opposed?
It has been seconded, so we need to vote on previous question.
Wonderful. All those who wish to move to previous question, please raise your placards. That is clearly not a majority, so we won't be moving forward. Although we don't have any negation speakers, let's move back to the affirmation. All those who wish to speak in the affirmation, raise your placards.
Point of order.
Senator Tang.
I just have a quick question. If someone gives another aff, can we still have a neg after that?
Right, so it says in the TOC rules specifically that if you have 2 speeches on the same side, or if you have 3 speeches on the same side, you can't have that. You must move to previous question.
You cannot have 3 speeches on the same side.
So if we do not have a negation speech after this affirmative speech, we will have to move to the question.
Okay.
That being said, I'm going to call again just because I didn't get to see everybody the first time. All affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. That goes to Senator Voss.
Thank you. For the chamber, that's Senator Vyas, spelled V-Y-A-S. Any indication when you're ready, I'll gladly begin. Perfect. 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 All right, just give me 1 minute to set up. All right, is this volume okay? Just want to make sure. Cool. All right. In 1987, Trump published his first book, The Art of the Deal. It must not have been as effective as he thought it was, because a decade later, he released the sequel, The Art of the Comeback. Executive overreach on international trade policy has been a mistake. Let's take a page out of Mr. Trump's book and pass today's legislation to truly come back. First, affirm today's legislation because it is effective in creating better trade policy by calling on checks and balances as a response to President Trump's erratic trade policy. The New York Times reports in June of 2018 that on trade, the president has quite simply been all over the place. One day, he threatened to impose tariffs on our NATO allies on national security. Another day, he exempted these allies. Quite simply, our president cannot be trusted to stick to his word. But let's understand what this legislation does that's so beneficial that negates our president's missteps. Senator Zhao tells us that President Trump's strong arming is beneficial because it gets us deals like the USMCA. Yes, President Trump is able to get us deals like the USMCA through his tactics, but that isn't the whole story, because the Pew Research Center found 2 weeks ago that as a result of President Trump's erratic behavior and strong arming during the USMCA trade process, Canadians in the status quo are describing the US as chaotic, confused, and as a bully. Senator Bokill tells us independently that the USTR is functioning independently. That isn't true. On its own, the USTR is incredibly dysfunctional. Because President Trump cannot be trusted to keep his word, it is up to us as the United States Congress to put a check on the executive branch and shift that responsibility over to the legislative. Now, second, take the neg on the highest ground. specifically Senator Bendoff, when he tells you that today's legislation might result in some tariffs being lost. Let's go from there. Now, don't think that my advocacy in the affirmative means that I think we should back down from our trade war with China. I agree that something needs to be done about China's exploitation of the economy, but that's why I stand in the affirmative, because banning all tariffs, or rather getting rid of some tariffs isn't inherently a bad thing. The NPR in June of 2018 outlined several other ways that the US can get back at China without using tariffs. We don't have to assume that even if the negative is right and some tariffs are lost, that is inherently a bad thing. Finally, Senator Smith has made it abundantly clear that we cannot pass today's legislation because it has a few typos. One response, 2 words, legislative intent. Just because it has a few typos doesn't mean we throw out the entire bill. That's why most Americans hate us, because we don't get anything done. Let's not repeat that same mistake. Personally, my favorite Trump book isn't The Art of the Deal or even The Art of the Comeback. It is Think Like a Champion. I ask this Congress, think like a champion. Affirm.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 11 seconds. All questioners, please raise your placards. And keep them in the same position, if that's okay. That goes to Senator Wang.
Hi, Senator. We recently passed an amendment that changed harmonized trade schedule to harmonized tariff schedule codes. What's the difference between these two codes?
Right, I'd say that the amendment we passed made it more relevant to the status quo in terms of actually
Okay, but what's the specific difference? Does a harmonized trade schedule exist?
No, our amendment changes it to something that now exists.
But the harmonized trade schedule did exist. It determines how a product is taxed when it ships across borders.
Right, regardless, what's the inherent harm?
But what does a harmonized tariff schedule do?
Senator Bokill.
Okay, so I said that the USTR works independently from the executive branch because they have separate committees, right? So how is there still bias from the president in regards to their actions?
Right. In the status quo, we are seeing that if President Trump wants tariffs, the USTR a few days or maybe a week later will advocate for those tariffs. We have to separate the executive branch from complete control of these tariffs.
But that's not necessarily true, right? The USTR is conducting an investigation. If Trump wants tariffs, he can go through 232.
Right. What I'm saying is that by
the question period has now elapsed.
Point of inquiry.
Senator Zhao.
Yeah, when was the initial start time of this round?
We started this round at 11:08.
11:08, thank you.
Yes. Senator Ranjan with a motion.
No, I just have a point of inquiry.
Point of inquiry, yes.
Just to clarify, how are you picking the order of speakers? Because I've just had my placard up since the first cycle, and I was just wondering if there was any reason I was being overlooked or anything like that.
Right. So the way I do it, which is the same for every single round, is that I go randomly, and then after that, I go off of precedence and recency. Because of the format, someone unfortunately has to be last. I'm definitely not overlooking you. It just happens to be because I'm choosing randomly, and it just didn't get to you yet.
Yeah, I with all due respect, I just wanted to know because I've had my placard up since the first cycle, but no worries, no worries.
So that's completely fine. I definitely don't intentionally drop anyone. That's definitely not something that I would do.
All right,
that being said, we had 2 affirmation speeches already in today's round. Let's move back to the negation cycle. All negative speakers, raise your placards. Thank you, Senator Tang.
Let's get the next 2 apps after this one, right? Woohoo. Okay. All judges ready? 1, 2, 3, okay. I'm not gonna lie. All of these talks on tariffs and trade wars, it's quite terrifying. But to me, this overall represents the exaggerated claims that the affirmation has been making. It's not as terrifying as it seems to be. And let me break down this debate and show you why the negation wins. So the first big negation argument has to deal with Trump's trade wars and trade tariffs and why that's a bad thing and we need to affirm. Two responses. First response is on solvency. According to the foreign policy on May 5th of 2019, you might have wondered why exactly Congress hasn't done anything yet. Congress actually can override executive orders, but why haven't they done anything? And the reason is A, because the president can override the veto and they would need a 2/3 majority, or B, there's simply not enough people to support this piece of legislation. Overall, if we look towards Section 1A, explains that such actions will need the authorization of the majority of the US Congress. There is no guarantee to solvency. My second response has to deal with the impacts of the affirmation. According to CNN News on August 15th of 2019, Trump's tariffs are bad in the short run, but good in the long run. According to USDA, they actually predict a 10% increase in farm profit in 2019, in contrast to a 69.4 billion. In a Purdue Center survey, 78% of farmers say that the trade war will actually benefit. We can't stop the trade war now that it's already continued on its roll. It's best to make the most out of it instead of relinquishing all of it. The second key argument that the affirmation makes has to deal with just Trump's image and the image that the executive power has in overall trade deals. Two responses. First, whether or not we affirm, that doesn't change Trump. According to NPR on April 17th of 2020, Trump's still going to be inconsistent. He's still going to say whatever he wants. And that's still going to mean a bad image for the United States. That's not unique. The second response I have is according to Reuters on December 10th of 2019, that Trump has most of the final say on trade deals because he is the president. If he has the final say, why would countries change in response? Now that we've defeated the two big arguments of the affirmation, let's move on to why the negation wins in terms of impacts. The biggest impact is how a 301 investigation works. If we affirm, we create more bureaucratic barriers to a 301 investigation, but that investigation is extremely necessary because it provides an investigation on IP reports. According to HG Legal Resources, they explain that we have lost, an average company has lost approximately $101 million due to IP theft. A decrease in 301 investigations is a decrease for the average American. Next, if we look towards the affirmations impacts, they actually don't really stand too true, because if we look towards the last section of Section 4, it states that all current Section 301 retaliatory actions will continue. Everything that's going on right now will stay the same way. Considering the upcoming 2020 election, as well as the COVID-19 epidemic, there's no way Trump's going to take even more rash action. With all those in mind, don't be terrified. Negate.
With the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 5 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards. That goes to Tiffany Zhao.
Hi, Senator. So in my speech, I proved to you that this legislation only stopped unilateral retaliatory action. So wouldn't Trump and the executive still be able to use non-retaliatory action, which would actually be the best thing in this trade war right now?
No, because why would Trump use non-retaliatory when he's the retaliatory type of guy?
It's his only option. He's done it in the past. You don't think he'll do it again if it's best for the American people, which it's proven to be?
See, I'm kind of confused on how that line of reasoning works, because the way Trump acts is that he likes to push for like you can see with his talks with like any nation, he's not gonna like change his line of thinking.
I'm just saying we don't lose complete control over
Decisions
in the trade
Senator
war.
Voss.
So if we pass today's legislation and the USTR determines tariffs to be in the best interest, what prevents them from still advising Congress subcommittees to levy these tariffs?
Well, I guess nothing, right?
Right. So then you're like, one of your points was that like tariffs are going to go down because like we can't stop the China trade war. Like, but that's not going, how is that still going to
point?
Thank you, speakers. The questioning time has now elapsed. We will return back to an affirmative cycle of debate. All speakers, raise your placards. Senator Ranjan.
I thank the chair. For my judges, any indication when you guys are ready, I'll be happy to begin. I'm speaking on the affirmation of this legislation. Good. And second judge, good. And PO, nice. As a whole, we have a tendency to oversimplify the most complex issues. You want to solve immigration reform? Great. Build a wall and everything will be solved. And if you want to end Chinese intellectual property theft, just slap them with tariff after tariff after tariff. By taking illogical actions like these, not only do we oversimplify the solutions, but we minimize their impacts as well. The impacts that the American people have to face at the end of the day. It's time we take a stand and pass today's legislation, not only to keep President Trump's power in check, but also to ensure that the art of the deal doesn't turn into the art of deception. Now, there's two reasons why the affirmation wins in today's debate. And the first point has to do with whether congressional oversight is absolutely necessary. What we're seeing under the status quo is that President Trump is in fact using Section 301 to justify additional tariffs on China. So Representative Bendoff and Bokill, you're right, Section 232 tariffs did in fact start the Chinese trade war, but that was only on aluminum and steel. Section 301 tariffs are on everything else that we've seen over the past 3 years. And the biggest inherent harm to that is that it's hurting our ability to fight the coronavirus, which I'm surprised almost nobody has brought up in today's debate. On March 20th of 2020, the Associated Press found that in the past month alone, hand sanitizer and swab imports were both down by 40%, and N95 respirators and surgical mask imports were down an additional 55%. These are the same equipments that we have a massive shortage of in our hospitals. And the reason for this is because China is the main manufacturer of this medical equipment. So every time we place additional tariffs on these goods, that ensures that we don't get this equipment. So Senator Tang, understand that we just can't roll with the punches during the trade war because it's hurting us in the long run. China isn't worried. We are the ones being affected. The real question we should be asking ourselves is why do we continue to impose tariffs when we know it's hurting our medical supply chains back home? And the answer lies with the president and the US Trade Representative. As the reason tells us in March 17th of 2020, the US Trade Representative was specifically warned about the possibility of a medical shortage back in 2018. And Ms. Bokill, that was done despite of the public hearings. So Senator Bendock and Representative Bokill argue that the US Trade Representative is independent, but the USTR is appointed by the president. If he wants to keep his job, it's in his best interest to listen to what the president wants to be done. And that's what he's been doing. And Senator Javeri, you argue about time restraints with exclusion project requests, but understand that with less tariffs that come as a result of congressional oversight, like Senator Farage explained in her speech, we won't have to deal with as many exclusion requests to begin with. I would argue that giving this Congress the power to actually take out these tariffs is much better than having one person in charge of it. But the second had to do with international legitimacy. But let's look at what President Trump is using to actually threaten other countries with these tariffs. As the marketplace tells us, on May 31st of 2019, Trump threatened to place a 5% tariff on all Mexican imports in an effort to pressure the country to cut back on illegal immigration. The same thing was done with Guatemala. He's literally using tariff tantrums on countries to do his bidding. But let's understand that when he uses irrational tariffs like these, that's not a democracy anymore. That's a dictatorship. And we're giving him full power to just threaten other countries and bully other countries to do his bidding. The power of the people is much stronger than this president.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards. That goes to Senator Hurley.
Hello, Senator. Great speech. So the negative's proven time and time again that the U.S. trade rep usually operates independent of the president. So how does your contention really stand that it's just a fear of, oh, they might lose their job if they're
okay? I kind of answered this. Yeah, I kind of answered this on two fronts. One, he was actually warned about public hearings before, and he continued that short-term economic gain and weighed that over the lives of American people. That's what we're seeing with coronavirus. And the second thing is he's appointed by the president. If he wants to keep his job, he's going to do everything the president says, and that's what he's doing.
Okay, so then let's talk about the sanctions that have actually been. Senator Donaldson, you're still muted.
Yeah.
My apologies, Senator Tang.
Okay, so according to Section 4, all current retaliatory tariffs will still be in place. How is passing going to affect the coronavirus?
Because we will ensure that additional tariffs don't add to the problem, right? We can stop this while we have the chance with this legislation. I don't think it's enough to just continue with tariffs.
Are there current problems? Is like Trump adding tariffs right now? Is that a problem?
Yeah, the Chinese trade war is ongoing and it's hurting our medical
adding tariffs right now in the midst of
He's done it in the past year. The past year alone, he's added plenty of tariffs. Despite the phase 1 trade deal, that doesn't cover tariffs on medical equipment.
Thank you, speakers. The questioning time has now elapsed.
I thank the chair.
I now call for all negation speakers, raise your placards. Any and all negation speakers? Seeing none, we will move back to the affirmation. All affirmative speakers. Thank you, Senator Wang.
I thank the chair. It's all been a long debate, so I'll make this quick. That's Wang, W-A-N-G. Any indication from my judges, and I'll begin. Great. Great, great. I am proud to live in a country where voices are heard and rights are established. We are seen as a worldwide leader, yet our checks and balances don't seem to be working in our favor in the status quo. It is because I stand here, not just as a member of Congress, but as a citizen who has the best interest of our long-term stability at heart. I proudly stand in the affirmation. First, it is imperative for Congress to reclaim trading power. The largest question we ask ourselves in today's debate is who is affected by today's legislation. The answer is consumers. Now, Representative Khan talks about the GDP, but Senator Zhao says that at the very beginning that this isn't true because it spurs distrust. But Senator Zhao, perhaps you'll agree that the larger problem is that more economists find that bulk of tariff costs are passed on to consumers. This is the most important impact that neg speakers have overlooked. Senator Farage, at the very beginning of today's debate, touches on household appliances, but let's quantify this. A 2019 study by researchers from the Federal Reserve and University of Chicago found that consumers bore between 125 and 225% of the cost of washing machine tariffs, indicating that appliance retailers charge even more than the tariffs have cost them. Consultation with Congress members should be conducted with the utmost transparency. Congress needs to act so that the United States doesn't squander 80 years of goodwill with partners and of trade-facilitated economic growth. But furthermore, today's legislation stimulates long-term growth. Turn the neg's arguments about legislative gridlock by looking at the importance of decreasing impulsive tariffs. This is the second most important question we ask ourselves. Does today's legislation decrease impulsive tariffs? And the answer is yes. Senator Tang says that Trump's tariffs are a good thing in the long run. But look to Columbia University, which explains in 2020 that impulsive tariff increases economically and statistically significant declines in domestic output and productivity. Senator Zhao talks about congressional unproductivity and gridlock, but against that claim, I look to George Mason University, which explains in 2018 that with regards to tariffs, there should be no trouble mustering a simple majority in both chambers of Congress. Instead, we see a benefit from a thought-out process. Senator Zhao talks about credibility with the president in the international realm, which is where I separate myself from Senator Hurley with 3 words: power in numbers. Being backed by an entire Congress instead of a single leader leads to increased reliability and global power, which is what we need at the end of the day. By securing tariffs and increasing productivity, our global hegemony and economy will see long-term improvements that both the aft side and the neg side continue to stress in today's debate. As a worldwide leader, we need to let our checks and balances work the way they're supposed to, and that is by passing today's legislation. Please pass.
For the judges, that was a speech of 2 minutes and 58 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards. That goes to Senator Zhao, Alex Zhao.
So who will take more decisive action in the long run? One man or hundreds of people in Congress?
Okay, as I said by that Columbia University study, in the case that we really do need to make a decision, that will be no problem to ensure that Congress makes an informed decision. Trump has shown historically that he makes impulsive decisions on tariffs. We need to be able to...
Sorry. So how many times has our Congress actually reached bipartisan support for a bill? Like in the past?
Okay, the thing is, as I said, power in numbers, the ability to use an entire Congress to think this through and have support on both sides instead of having a single president be able to make a decision in like a split of a second.
Thank you. That goes to Senator Javary.
Thank you. Hi, Ms. Wang. So is it a good idea right now to pass a legislation that comprises the time it takes for exclusion deals by over 90%? How are manufacturing sectors supposed to get this aid?
Numerous senators, including Representative Zhao and Khan, have both responded to that question. The whole idea is that increasing congressional approval means that in the long term, we're increasing the effectiveness of our tariffs. Impulse tariffs.
Why does time has now elapsed? Since everyone has spoken, I entertain motions on the floor. Senator Farage.
I move to previous question.
Are there any seconds? Great. Any opposed? Seeing none, we'll vote on the motion. All those who wish to go to previous question, raise your placard. Wonderful, it's majority. All those who wish to pass today's piece of legislation, raise your placard and keep it there. All those who wish to fail. Any abstentions? On a vote of 9, are you an abstention, Senator Boko? No, you already voted? Great. On a vote of 9 to 6 to 0, this piece of legislation does pass. Senator Khan.
Being a natural break in debate, I move for a 5-minute recess.
Any seconds? Any opposed? Seeing none, we're in a 5-minute recess. We will reconvene at.
Point of order. There were some
Point of
people that
order.
were opposing.
Yeah.
Senator Bendock, sorry, say that again.
I said point of order. There were some people that wanted that were opposing this motion, so we have to vote on it.
My apologies. I did not see the placards raised because it was kind of after the fact. That's fine. We'll do it again. We'll vote on it. All those who wish to move. Senator Boco.
Okay, right before we vote, what time does this session end? Because it's 2.5 hours from when we started. So
Right. So just to kind of keep the confusion out of things, we started at 11:08. We have a hard stop at 1:30. That's the situation.
Unfortunately, to order.
I'm sorry.
I called the session to order at 11:03.
Okay, great. Okay, so then that would go all the way to like 1:33. We'd have a few extra minutes to make sure we have 2.5 hours completely. We took a little bit of extra time with all the amendments today, so that kind of slowed us down, but I'll do the vote again. All those who wish to move to the recess, raise your placard. All those who are opposed, raise your placard. There are more opposed than there are in favor, so we will continue with the debate. Just for the judges, I understand we've been here for a while. Does anyone need to quickly do something before we continue? Seeing none, Senator Farage.
I was just wondering if you could put the recency and number of questions in the chat when you get a chance. Just so
wonderful. I was just about to take a picture and put that in there. Just give me a second. I'm happy.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That being said, we're going to continue on the next piece of legislation. All those who have a sponsorship, please raise your placard. Senator Voss, unopposed.
All right, cool. Once again, for the chamber, that's Representative Yoss. I understand we're short on time, so I'm going to get going as soon as possible. Any indication from the judges? Perfect, perfect, perfect. All right, Senator Donaldson? Perfect. All right, and I will get going. This week, Americans across the nation waited for a stimulus check that for millions was delayed. The reason? President Trump insisted to have his name appear on the check. Too often, this government makes decisions that, just like that stimulus check, seem to hurt Americans, even when at the best of times, we're trying to help. Today, I say no more missteps by the government. Today's legislation will truly get us out of this pandemic. And it's because of that, I am proud to sponsor today's legislation. First, let's address the problem that in the status quo, we have no time to wait on. The International Monetary Fund reported 5 days ago that the latest Global Financial Stability Report shows that the financial system has already felt a dramatic impact as a result of the COVID-19 recession, and a further intensification of the crisis could affect global financial stability. Everyone in this chamber, I hope, knows that we are staring in the face of another economic shutdown, just like the year 2008. That is why I sponsored today's legislation, because we have no time to waste in order to create change for our American constituents. But now let's address what today's legislation does that gets us the solution that all of us want. First, let's focus on section 2C and 2D of today's legislation, the meatiest ones that provide the most benefits to the average American constituent. First, the Columbia School of Law reports on August 3rd of 2016 that executives in the United States in large corporations stand to benefit the most from stock buybacks. The principle of stock buybacks is that executives will use this extra cash flow, and instead of giving that money to its workers, uses it to increase their share in the corporation. It's rampant in the status quo, and I put it as a part of today's legislation because it is a detriment to thousands of American constituents. Thousands of corporations have already stopped issuing stock buybacks, but if we pass today's legislation and ensure that no corporation that receives government funding is allowed to do this, they can use that extra money in order to fund the other parts of today's legislation. And then secondly, I included section 2D of today's legislation because too often in the status quo, the 99% lose out to the 1% 100% of the time. I put that stipulation in the status quo and in this legislation because the people who should be expected to finance this legislation shouldn't also be the ones who are expected to receive benefits. Section 2D ensures that the people who stand to benefit will benefit from those who have the means to help the financial security. Ensure that we come out of this crisis stronger than ever. Sponsor and affirm today's legislation.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. All questioners, please raise your placards. That goes to Senator Joel.
Thank you for that speech, Senator. So what are the benefits of an employee stock plan?
Right. So I'd say that like if you're talking about section 2E, those are like in the status quo, employee stock plans like are basically just a way of corporations.
Dividends, right? You get paid dividends?
Right. But those dividends don't matter if those workers are out of a job.
Yeah. Section 2F mandates that dividends can't be paid until a company has cash reserves. How do you reconcile that?
Right. I'd say that today's legislation, by ensuring that companies that receive money from the government.
Hi, so let's talk about Section 2D. Can the federal government regulate salaries of private corporations?
I'd say that even if they can't in the status quo, like this now more than ever is the time for changes to be made to the current system. We have to
but nothing in U.S. code gives us the ability to dictate salaries of private companies.
Right, so then I'd say we pass this legislation and let the judicial branch determine the constitutionality of it. I'd rather do that than do nothing.
Senator, so right now for many corporations, are their revenues decreasing or increasing?
Decreasing.
Exactly. So how do we enact a minimum wage, for example, $15? How do we get people to not get laid off?
Right. So Section 1 says that the companies that have to institute these measures are ones that are receiving government funds. And 2, a lot of corporations in the status quo have some extra money, but instead they're using it on buying.
And those loans have to be paid out. Those loans have to be paid back eventually, right? So how are they going to pay it back?
Tiffany Zhao.
Hi, Senator. So companies have an option to opt in or opt out for government bailout money, correct?
Correct.
At first sight of all these restrictions that are attached with this bailout money, don't you think that companies will just opt out?
Right. If a company needs bailout money, it means it is in trouble. It doesn't have the option, like it can either go bankrupt.
There are alternatives that they can go to that might be preferable once they see how much control they're going to have to give over.
The questioning period has now elapsed. We will move to a negation cycle of debate. All negative speakers, please raise your placards and keep them just keep them there so I can see. That goes to, hold on, a couple more people rose their placards. That goes to Senator Zhao, Alex Zhao.
Thank the chair. This is Senator Zhou speaking for the second time, spelled Z-H-O-U. As always, I'm at the leisure of those above me, so any indication. All right. Sounds good. I've been reading a lot of news recently due to the pandemic, and I came upon a pretty crazy article. Walmart is selling more tops than pants. But who knew that Walmart's clothing sales could be an allegory for the United States government? We continually focus more on the top classes rather than the bottom classes. And that's why I'm disappointed today. Because while I like Walmart, we can't blindly follow the allegory they set for us, because affirming today's legislation harms our most vulnerable Americans and only benefits the top classes. Let's get right into it. Affirming today's legislation increases the likelihood of companies defaulting, since executive income isn't necessarily based on finances. That's because not all things executives get is technically a salary, but today's legislation caps the amount of executive salary. Companies usually give executives compensation based on other things, like things that don't go into your salary, things like stock options or maybe an asset, like a yacht. Stanford University in 2018 tells us that of the companies listed in the S&P 500, CEO compensation packages are dominated by incentive-based pay. What this means is that only 13% of total compensation is salary-based. The other 87% is things like stocks and options, whose ultimate value depends on performance. And those things aren't usually taxed under your wage. They're put into stocks and taxed under the capital gains tax. And the capital gains tax rate is much less than the annual income tax rate. But that's dangerous, because if you put a salary cap on the executives, companies will rather just give them more stock options instead. So Senator Vyas, I completely agree. We are in an exigent situation and we need financial stability right now. But here's the problem. Companies are going to default more as a result because they're going to be giving more stock options in return. Columbia University in November 2010 found that using a data panel of 117 firms from 1995 to 2008, stock options and compensation increased the probability of default risk. That's the most dangerous impact of today's debate, because this leads to two things in particular. First, there's more corporate debt because more companies are going to default and fail. And that increases corporate liability insurance because companies are immediately seen as more risky because they rather consolidate the wealth to the top using stock options. But secondly, it harms the market overall because Senator Vyas talks about the market being in an extreme fluctuation right now. But at the very best, you get extreme growth and extreme contraction. But you're far more likely to get a petering out that doesn't help the economy because these companies default. But now let's go to the American constituent. Buybacks are necessary in recessionary periods. That's because companies need money right now. Most companies, especially larger ones, are facing immense losses. They can't stay afloat because the money coming in was equal to the money going out, and they have very little cash on hand. Senator Vyas, you're right. Stock buybacks are dangerous and only benefit executives, but that's not the case during recessionary periods. McKinsey & Company in March 2020 tells us that being optimistic about demand recovery is a real problem, especially for companies with working capital or liquidity shortages and those veering towards bankruptcy. Buybacks are good because they prevent companies from losing billions of dollars when a recession hits and their stocks are no longer worth anything. This is literally the most only way to productively use your money and make sure that your company doesn't go down. When we affirm today's legislation, we harm stock buybacks, and in turn, we make it harder for employees to actually get the aid that they need in the long term. Because when these companies go down, the employees go down with it. Excluding Walmart, I've read a lot of crazy articles this week. Let's not let this Congress's failure be the craziest article I read. Negate.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. All questioners, please raise your placards. That goes to Senator Farage.
Hi, Senator. What is the purpose and function of a buyback?
So a buyback is usually when a company buys back its own stocks, but these are necessary because when the stock—
So what do companies use to perform buybacks?
Well, they buy back their stocks through the stock market.
Okay, under this legislation, we prohibit them to do that,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So how are companies generally using these buybacks in the status quo?
So generally they use it in order to inflate their value, but that's not the case.
Right, but they're also using it for the top executives. Doesn't that solve for this under this
The
legislation?
danger of stock buybacks
Thank
only—
you. That goes to Senator Ranjan.
Hi, Senator, bouncing off that previous line of questioning, how do we know that artificially inflating the price is actually going to help the constituents instead of the higher ups because they're in charge of the market?
During a recession, this is no longer about inflating the price of the company.
Rather, but that's exactly what a stock buyback is. That is what a stock buyback is, right?
Okay, when a recession occurs, the stock value drops to zero. But when you engage in stock buybacks, you make sure that the company can stay afloat for longer.
Yeah, and who's getting that money? The executives, right? The higher ups, the CEO, the people running it.
Company to still stay alive.
Thank you. That goes to Tiffany Zhao.
Just a few really simple yes or no questions. So companies use profits to do stock buybacks, correct?
Yes.
Yes. So if we prohibit the use of stock buybacks and prohibit that practice, doesn't that force them to use profits to do something else?
Well, not necessarily, because if they use their—
It's just a yes or no question. Doesn't it force them to do something else?
I'd argue no then, because
why
stock
not?
buybacks essentially—
What are they going to do with their profits then? Just sit
Thank
there?
you. That goes to Senator Voss.
During the 2008 financial crisis, did stock buybacks go up or down?
I believe they went up.
No, they went down.
Okay, sorry.
Right, but if stock buybacks were so good, why didn't other executives do it? Right? Do you know something that like other Fortune 500 executives don't?
Of course not. But what I'm saying is that it's important to maintain the value during a recession. And
right, but then why didn't executives do it if it was so beneficial to the company?
I don't know, but what I'm saying is that—
Thank you, speakers. The questioning period has now elapsed. We will now—
Personal privilege.
Yes, you can.
Sorry.
Just pop function. You're totally good.
Sorry, I did it twice and I don't think you saw, so I just—
Oh, my apologies.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
And Senator Zhao, you're both good. All affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Senator Tang, unopposed.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, room. Thank you, room. What can I say? Just give me a second. That didn't happen? Whoa. Okay, all judges ready? PO ready? Party ready? Everyone in the room seems ready? Let's get this going. Indifference is easy. It's easy to stand by and do absolutely nothing while you watch as other people suffer. You know, it's easy to be the bystander instead of actually helping the victim. The unfortunate reality in today's Congress is that we have been indifferent too long to the growing economic and unequal divide between the poor and the rich. The legislative intent of today's piece of legislation is to provide a fair, more equitable policy for all Americans. And for that reason, I affirm. So unlike Representative Bias, who's talking about the coronavirus outbreak and how it will impact it, I'm just going to talk about how the working conditions have been in high corporation companies. According to The Guardian on February 5th of 2020, many Amazon workers condemn unsafe, grueling conditions. They have a pressure to work faster. They're being treated like robots. And unfortunately, we seem to be doing nothing about it. But this legislation gives us a stopgap to prevent those things. And the reason why is because within Section 2B, it explains that all employees of the receiving entity will make at minimum $15 per hour within 1 year of the appropriation date. In essence, what we are doing is to large corporations of over 250 million entities who are receiving some sort of cash infusion, loan guarantee, or grant from the United States, we will increase their minimum wage to a certain quantity that benefits Americans. According to the economic policy of November 17 of 2019, increasing the minimum wage has vast impacts on our economy. Not only does it increase GDP in the long run, protect minorities that are being abused currently, but perhaps most importantly, it gives people money to live. Money so that they don't have to live day by day on paycheck by paycheck. Representative Joe, I understand your concerns, but there's some problems I would like to note. First, it really doesn't make sense while going to stock auctions increases the chance of default. I don't really see how you explain the difference between a stock option and giving compensation. But when you go on to your second point and you explain why stock buybacks are actually good, I would argue that stock buybacks are actually an overall worse thing, because in most past cases of recession, even if the company inflates its price, that only is a false evaluation. That's not the true thing. Instead of having companies overarch their company on a whole, it's better to have the government step in and provide stimulus instead of having them to fake the amount of money they have, which is bad economics in the long run. But the second reason why you affirm today's piece of legislation is because we provide executive salaries cannot exceed 100 times of the median salary. I think we all know this, what's going on right now. According to Business Insider in February of this year, executive salaries are topping the charts again and again. This means less money for overall workers, but the most important impact is that these workers feel devalued because their executives make so much more than them. We need our workers to be productive and happy. Don't be indifferent. Affirm.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 9 seconds. All questioners, please raise your placards. That goes to Senator Bendock.
Thank you. So if we ban stock buybacks, does that mean that executives are no longer going to try to make profits elsewhere?
I mean, that happens in both worlds, right? Yeah,
Oh.
You're right.
Yeah, but if you ban stock buybacks, doesn't it make it more likely that they practice other methods to inflate their stock prices?
See, the problem with any that type of argument is that if they can do it right now, there's no difference with affirming Tuesdays. Unless you can prove that that's worse than stock buybacks, then I will buy your argument.
Okay, I will.
Okay.
Thank you. Senator Mehta.
All right, so right now, what's stopping companies from still making a profit in regards to like supply not happening?
What do you mean?
Okay, so right now, are companies creating a steady supply of goods for people in the country?
I would say no because of the coronavirus outbreak.
Okay, and what happens if we give more money to consumers? Does demand increase or decrease?
If we give more money to consumers, then demand increases because they can.
All right, so what happens if there's a low supply of goods and a high demand of people wanting these goods? Do prices go up or down?
Prices, I don't know. Like,
Okay,
The
they'll go up.
Period has now elapsed. Due to our parliamentarian needing a quick break, we'll take a 2-minute in-house recess.
Wait, guys, can I say something real quick? I know my last name is similar to both Senator Joel's and Senator Zhao's. So do you guys like want to call me by something else? That way it's easier, like Z or something.
Well, so the way I've been doing it, just to kind of clarify, is that whenever I've called on either you or Tiffany, I've called by your first and last name, just so everyone knows for precedence and recency. But if you guys want to create like a shorter way to do that, that's great. I just was calling for the full name every time.
Okay, yeah.
It doesn't really work because we have the same
pronunciation?
first name too.
Really
Oh.
quick, I was gonna say, can we get a split within these 2 minutes? Because I know some people aren't like, I don't know how the timer is gonna work.
Yeah,
If you're
we're gonna have we kind of exhausted a lot of our time on the first bill, but that's okay. But yeah, so all those who want to speak on the affirmation who haven't spoken yet, raise your placards. Two. Okay, all those who are on the negation. Okay, so clearly people need to flip AF. I'm trying to post the precedence and recency chart in the chat, but it's like coming back. But if anyone has a question right now, I'm happy to take it to see where you are in speaking.
I'm not sure if you can post pictures in these because there's a lot of like restrictions. So maybe
Yeah, it's really not, it's not working well, but if someone has a question for me about where they are, I'm happy to let them know.
Yeah, who am I behind?
Wait,
Okay,
who's going?
hold on, I'll just start with Senator Farage real quick. So for you, you are second from the top.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Senator Joel, do you want to know the same thing?
Yeah.
You are 1, 2, 3. You are fourth in the list, so you are 3 down from the top.
Thank you.
I just had a quick point of inquiry.
Yeah.
My laptop is like completely frozen. Is there any way I can just quickly join again?
Yeah, that's completely fine. Since we're about to get started, I'd rather have everyone in the chat.
Okay, I'll just do that. Thank you.
Great. Great.
Can I ask about my question?
We are going to continue at this point because we need to get speeches in. However, if you pose a question in the chat, I can tell you while we're doing this. I'm just not able to post the pictures for some reason, so I apologize about that.
No problem. Thank you.
We will move back to the negation in today's cycle. All negative speakers, please raise your placards. And keep them raised because some people are adding. That goes to Senator Bendock.
Thank you. This is Michael Bendock. I spoke fourth on the last bill. If that helps you find my ballot. Just a thumbs up when you're ready would be awesome. Ready. I'm just cool, right? Right before this session, I was on a call with Amazon's Jeff Bezos, Google's Larry Page, and the Democrats' biggest embarrassment, Michael Bloomberg, to discuss the future of our economy from the perspective of my donors. I mean, our country's most influential stockholders. But the moment they told me to pass this bill, I knew that this speech would be political suicide because our careers mean nothing when our constituents are suffering. We have no choice but to fail this bill. First, fail this bill because it incentivizes stockholders to make decisions that harm American workers. Senator Vyas and Tang are concerned with stock buybacks, and Senator are worse options. So let me do so. Let's use their logic that corporations consistently put profits before people. Investors will clearly seek out other methods of ownership inflation that certain increased mergers, such as increased mergers and acquisitions. In a landmark study, Gardner of the Washington University finds that following an acquisition of another company, officers' compensation levels increase, even when the purchase turns out to be unprofitable. Because while a bad merger can decrease the value of a company's stock, CEOs acquire new stock options once the deal goes through. Increased acquisitions, although profitable for officers, lead to layoffs. Alana Samuel of Atlantic writes in 2017 that mergers create redundancies. Businesses don't need 2 divisions of accountants or 2 factories to fulfill the same purpose. To eliminate those, they cut jobs, and those losses fall hardest on the communities that have no other job to go to. Senator Tang, this is a worse option than stock buybacks. Please stand on the negation. And Senator Vyas, don't let lobbyists trick you. When you pass this piece of legislation, thousands of American workers will lose their jobs because of corporate greed. But second, fail this bill because it destroys the small business economy. The US Census Bureau finds in March of this year that only 6,000 of America's companies make more than $250,000 a year. So under Section B and E of this piece of legislation, only those 6,000 companies pay a minimum wage of $15 per hour and offer stock options. But Senator Chang, not only did Amazon already raise its minimum wage to $15 an hour last October, Michael Salzman of the Employment Policies Institute finds the vast majority of people earning the minimum wage aren't working at large corporations. Roughly half minimum wage workforce is employed at small businesses. Senator Vyas, in the short run, most Americans won't be helped. And in the long run, they'll likely be hurt. This is because of the lack of skilled employment at small businesses. The National Federation of Independent Businesses finds that 24% of small business owners cited difficulty finding qualified workers. That's their single most important problem. Increasing the mandatory minimum wage and offering workers stock options will incentivize all minimum wage workers to flock from large corporations to small businesses. And when these businesses employ 64% of our workforce, we have no choice but to fail this bill. This bill is a hypocrisy. It aims to benefit Americans, but it benefits corporations. Don't let lobbyists trick you. Fail this bill.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 8 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards and keep them there. That goes to Senator Tang.
Okay, can you briefly re-explain why acquisitions lead to job loss?
Because when you acquire another company, you no longer need the Department of Secretaries or the same factory at your company and that new one. So you're going to cut all the jobs from that new one to take away redundancies.
So companies are going to start mass buying other companies once we affirm?
No, they're going to start buying smaller ones in order to increase their stock options. One, because it's profitable in the long run, and two, because officers would make more money. That's their incentive.
Okay, so 50% of those workers are in small businesses. Doesn't that mean 50% are still in the big businesses? We're still helping half, right?
Senator Bokill.
They don't.
Okay, so you talk a lot about corporate greed, right? Like, how prevalent is this greed when we're in a recession? Like, are they really trying to like benefit their executives, or at the end of the day, are they trying to help everyone?
First off, in a recession, corporate greed doesn't really matter either way. They're still laying off workers. We see that 45 million people just try to get unemployment benefits. So I think that's non-unique.
So we're giving them money to try to bail them out.
And the period has now elapsed. The speakers may go back on mute. We will now return to an affirmative cycle of debate. All speakers, raise your placards. Is there a motion?
So we are noticing a little bit of extra lag in this chamber. What I'm going to ask is for participants, can you all turn off your cameras for a second? Okay, judges, if you could each say a sentence or something, just so I can test the lag.
Hello.
Hello. Testing.
Hi there.
Okay. Participants, if you want to pop back on. What I think I'm going to do is it is 1:08 right now. I am going to extend. Well, first off, did the judges hear the previous speech okay?
I heard it. There were a couple of points in which it cut off. And I know that Senator Bindock and I have been working on his internet issues. I think he switched the Wi-Fi. I'm not sure if that helped. I think that they were the same issues.
Okay, so what I'm going to ask this chamber to do then is let's have everybody leave the meeting and pop back on, and we will just extend the debate by 5 minutes or however long it takes everybody to get back in. Okay?
That includes judges too, right?
That goes for judges too, and we're going to reach out to Mr. Jacoby about the live streaming.
I had a quick question.
Yes.
For some reason, my laptop keeps freezing. It's not even like a Wi-Fi issue. It just stops like working, so I had to leave and come back. Do you have any
Can
like?
you restart your machine?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, let's see if this gets fixed with resetting everything.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna need everybody to go off, to drop off and like cut out Zoom, and then I will reopen the meeting at 1:12. So we will just add 8 minutes to your end time. So parliamentarian, that looks like that's a total of 10 extra minutes added to your session.
Really quick, I had a question.
Senator Mehta, do you?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Could
Sure.
you hear me? Yeah, so my hand raised feature just like also doesn't work on my laptop. Is it possible for me to raise my placard, or all the or is the video turned off for everyone?
Madam Chair, would you be okay with that if Senator Mehta used her placard and everyone else used their hand raise? If that's freezing her computer?
Yeah, sorry, I just heard that. It just came through. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Thank you.
Wait, sorry, another question. Just to clarify, is the hand raise different from like the reactions?
Yeah, you go to participants and then you can just click on raise hand.
Okay, where do I, okay.
Participants, yeah.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
The only other thing with the raising hand feature is you just have to remember to turn it off after so that you're not getting like a speech on the side you don't want and stuff like that.
Okay, Representative Khan.
Point of inquiry, so what's the end time now of this session?
It is 1:46 Eastern time.
Thank you.
All right, it seems from my end like things are moving pretty well. So I am going to turn it back over to the parliamentarian.
Great, thank you so much to Tab for helping us work through those technology issues. Senator Bendock has asked a question in the chat. I just want to confirm with our two judges, you were able to hear Senator Bendock's speech. If you could just give a thumbs up so that I can make sure. Look, they're both nodding. So Senator Bendock, you are good to go. So we will proceed on to the next speech. I'll hand it back over to our presiding officer. Please keep me posted in the chat box if you're having any technology issues so that we can contact Tab.
Wonderful. Senator Khan, that point of personal privilege is granted. Before that, I believe I had already called on a speaker. Just before we get started, is that true for the whole chamber? I believe I called on Tiffany Zhao to speak. So we're going to proceed with that.
Point of order, I think I had my thing up too, but because it was so lagging, like I didn't go up at the right time because I couldn't hear when you called speakers. And then the other lady came in and told us to stop. So
okay, that being the case, since clearly I have some problems on my end where it's difficult to see everybody at the right time, it's like delayed, I will just call again for everyone to rise. So affirmative speakers, you can do the hand raise, or for Senator Mehta, you can put your placard up. And that would go to Senator Mehta.
I thank the chair. Can everyone hear me properly? Awesome, thank you. Okay, everyone good? Awesome, thank you. I have to say, preparing this legislation was nothing but exciting, mostly because it threw me back to my high school economics class that I took around 30 years ago. So let's examine this bill from the lens of my high school economics classroom and understand why passing today's legislation is really the only way to go during times of financial uncertainty. First, true or false, the current stimulus package that Congress has passed is enough to suffice the American people. That's false, and that's furthered by Lawrence Devine from the Howard Schneider from Reuters, which states in 2020 that in a research note last week, Bank of America analysis said that the aid package passed was the very bare minimum. In fact, they estimated that the government will need a total of $3 trillion in fiscal stimulus and more if the recession deepens. But here's why that makes this bill so uniquely important to pass right now. because if the stimulus runs out within the period of allotted time, we are going to go back to a problem. And the problem being that we'll see an inevitable recession occurring. This very exigency, which my side has been pushing from the beginning of today's debate, blocks any negative rebuttal about minute inefficiencies within the bill, specifically from Senators Zhao and Bendock. Ultimately, we need to understand that if we pass today's legislation today and affirm more stimulus to the American people and to different companies, we ensure that the stimulus that we've passed recently doesn't run out and we don't reach a point where a recession is very inevitable. But next, on the point of stock buybacks, which has honestly become the most contested point in round, do they A, restrict employee benefits, or B, encourage employee benefits? The answer is a resounding A, in that stock buybacks are actually very, very problematic. And that's furthered by the New York Times, which finds that share buybacks can prevent investors from taking controlling stake in the company or give management stock options to distribute as compensation, because buybacks represent short-term thinking, say, as they up these cash that companies should be spending on innovation, investment, or emergency preparation, which was lacking in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, some analysts even trace back the actual financial disaster that happened regarding COVID-19 to lack of emergency preparation from stock buybacks. So don't listen to the advocacy of Senator Zhao. Banning stock buybacks under Section 2 is actually going to be beneficial. But now, look to the most important impact in today's round, that of domestic abuse victims. Understand that the Washington Post finds that calls to domestic hotlines in Spain have jumped 18%, and a state-run hotline website has seen a 270% increase. This trend is only paralleled in the United States. But when we pass today's bill and give women or any victims of domestic abuse more disposable income to use on their needs, we are able to aid them during a period of restriction and a period of harm. At the end of the day, prioritize those who are constantly pushed under the rug. Look to those who are truly being impacted the most by the COVID-19 pandemic. Look to the abuse victims and look to the people who need the money most. Stand with me and pass today's legislation.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 11 seconds. All questioners, raise your placards and just keep them there for a bit just to make sure everyone can be considered. That goes to Senator Alex Zhao.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that people can't buy stocks when companies participate in stock buybacks. But in a recession, who is buying stocks?
I didn't say that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Then what can companies do if they can't sell their products, open their stores, or even have their factories function? Like, what can they do with their profits?
Yeah, I think that that's like a huge issue, obviously, but I think that the reason that this bill is so important is that it's not necessarily a stimulus bill for companies, but rather it forces companies to comply with regulations that trickles income down to people who need it.
Senator Joel.
Thank you for that speech, Senator. So can you point to me the section of this bill that actually increases the total stimulus?
So the entire bill doesn't necessarily, like, there's different sections that increase stimulus in regards to
It's just requirements for already existing stimulus, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so how does it stimulate the economy?
That was not my reasoning. My
That
entire
was the
speech
crux
was
of your argument,
specifically.
correct?
No, all my argumentation was
has now elapsed. We will move back to a negative cycle of debate. All speakers raise your placards and keep them there just to accommodate technology for a second. Are you raising your placard, Senator Bokill? Sorry, it's difficult for me to see. I'm trying to make sure. You are?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm just hearing this, so it's taking longer. Sorry about that. That goes to Senator Hurley. Oh, my apologies. That goes to Senator Smith. It's wobbling. I'm trying to figure out how to do this. I might be able to do reactions. That might be better.
Motion.
Point of order.
Senator, who's motioning?
I am. Senator Javeri.
Senator Javeri.
I believe the speech goes to Mr. Joel. I think he spoke like fifth. Yeah.
I apologize. I cannot see. It's very
no worries.
weird, so it's difficult to see. Senator Joel, did you have your placard read? Wonderful.
Yes.
You. Apologies to the chamber. It's hard to hear and it's hard to see everything moving.
Can we try and use the raise hand function.
Yeah.
And for those that cannot use the raise hand function, please let your presiding officer know that you will be raising your placard instead. But I think that we need to try and use that function due to the lag that we are experiencing.
Yeah, from now on, I'm happy to do all hand raising functions. If anyone you can't, Senator Mehta, I will look for you in the gallery. That being said, Senator Joel, you do have the speech.
I thank the chair. That's Senator Joel, Joel, speaking for the second time this legislative session. As always, I'm at the leisure of those above me, so give me any indication when you're ready. While most of the media has turned to Dr. Fauci for reliable information, Fox News has a different strategy. The program brought on Dr. Phil to discuss the COVID pandemic. Well, it's ridiculous to turn to a doctor whose biggest career moment was feuding with the Cash Me Outside girl. This Congress risks making a similar mistake. By passing this legislation, we ignore facts and reason while stumbling into the territory of rash judgment and oversight. So first, fail today's legislation because it is riddled in crippling contradictions. Let's begin with sections 2E and 2F, which Senator Baez fails to introduce. Employee shareholding is not beneficial until the company can pay dividends to shareholders. In fact, this contradiction creates a perverse incentive for companies to keep their cash reserves under the amount appropriated by Congress, as long as possible to avoid corporate responsibility. Furthermore, the requirement under Section 2A is an impossible task. Companies can't keep payroll the same and pay $15 minimums even if CEO compensation is restructured. Economist Mark Perry found that if all S&P 500 companies limited their CEO pay ratio to 20-1 and redistributed the extra money to their minimum wage workers, it would only increase salaries by about 4 cents per hour. This Congress writes functional legislation, not fairy tales. Unless these flaws are fixed, vote to fail. But second, fail because it all but guarantees a seismic shift to automation. Now, Senator Tang says Amazon employees are being treated like robots. I find that wording ironic. Michael Corkley writes in the Times this year that before the pandemic, automation had been gradually replacing human work in a range of jobs as companies looked to cut labor costs. But now that we are living in the midst of a pandemic as well as a recession, the incentive to switch to automation has never been stronger. Senior Brookings fellow Mark Murrow writes that COVID has accelerated the trend of companies replacing workers with technology. This Congress still has a sliver of opportunity to take a stand for America's workers, but by passing this legislation, we guarantee an irreversible shift for 2 reasons. First, Section 2B institutes a permanent $15 minimum wage. While the intent is to help low-paid workers, the result is far more sinister. Economist Grace Lorden finds in a 2019 study that increasing the minimum wage significantly increases the likelihood that low-skilled workers in automatable jobs become unemployed. But second, Section 2D caps executive salaries at 100 times the median salary. Yet Professor Edmonds writes in 2017 that CEOs will invest in automation rather than labor to improve the ratio and consequently secure themselves more pay. What does this mean for our constituents? A Brookings study concluded in 2017 that roughly 36 million Americans have a high susceptibility to automation. While these times truly are unsettling, to really benefit Americans, fail today's legislation.
For the judges, that was a speech of 2 minutes and 53 seconds. All questioners use the hand function. And Senator Mehta, if you have a question, I will look for you. Sorry, it takes a second for me to see it's coming in. That goes to Senator Farage.
Hi, Senator. So right now, excuse me. Okay. Hi, Senator. Right now, these companies are desperate to make profit, right?
Yeah.
So why would they intentionally decrease the amount of profit that they have?
They're not intentionally decreasing the amount of profit.
You told us that they're going to intentionally keep their profits low.
I said cash reserves specifically.
So why would they keep
want
those cash reserves low?
Because the legislation makes a contradiction. It says you can only pay dividends to shareholders in the employee benefit fund if you have cash reserves lower than the amount given by Congress.
Okay, but if we're giving employees more,
Hey, so I've got a value question to start this off. Which, in your opinion, matters more, monetary gains or quality of living gains? Which one is the higher purpose here?
So I see what you're getting at here. What I would argue is it's better to have a job and be paid something than to lose your job to a robot. So at the point where our legislation is causing mass unemployment, I think the status quo is infinitely preferable.
Okay, so what's to actually encourage companies to use these buy-ins if they're going to be imposing such strict stipulations if they can't already afford it?
What do you mean by buy-ins?
The speaking time for that, or the questioning time is now elapsed. Thank you, speakers.
I move to address the parliamentarian.
Senator Zhao, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was just thinking like earlier when we were talking about like the raise hand versus placard thing, I was looking at the time and that was like took up like a considerable like 2 minutes. And then like I think because the raise hand function kind of increases the amount of time it takes to select questioners, would it be possible to add on a little bit more time towards the end?
I would need to check with tab room. Let me get back to you and I'll let you know when I hear back.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And if you can, I totally understand.
I'll let you know.
I just wanted to, yeah, I just wanted to quickly address you. My raise hand feature is working, so you don't need to look for my placard anymore.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other motions or points of inquiry on the floor? Seeing none, I will now call for all affirmative speakers, raise your placards. And I guess we should do the hand function. Let's do the hand function on that. Just because it's
lagging. End at 150.
Okay, sorry for the delay. Just give me a second. It's difficult to see. It's all coming in at different times. But off of recency, that goes to Senator Khan.
I thank the chair. Hi, everyone. I'm Senator Khan speaking for the second and last time today. Just give me a indication whenever you're ready. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you're ready, thank you. I don't want to confuse anyone, but I'm really in disagreement with this bill's title. Because I don't want to pass this bill just because it's going to benefit Americans instead of large organizations during unsettling times. I plan to pass this legislation because it's going to benefit Americans all the time. Affirm. So first, let's contextualize this debate for Americans within the status quo, something no other speaker has done. Understand that there's going to be a significant increase in inequality as the coronavirus epidemic continues to spread. Flattening inequality is going to be your top priority in today's debate. Max Fisher, writing for the New York Times on March 16th of 2020, explained that the coronavirus is deepening the consequences of inequality, pushing burdens onto low-income Americans who are more likely to suffer from the economic losses of this pandemic. The problem isn't with our financial system, like Senator Vias and everyone else in this debate has told you. The problem is with the millions of Americans suffering. In a debate about people, it's disheartening that the negation has ignored them. And that's why I'd like to set a burden on them to prove that this legislation worsens economic prospects for those Americans directly affected, something that they have failed to do thus far. Then, Senator Zhao tells you that this legislation hurts workers, but that's fundamentally false. That's because passing this legislation decreases that inequality by raising the minimum wage, and that's the first reason that you want to affirm. I want to distance myself from Senator Tang, who told you that the minimum wage helps our economy, because I want to focus on how it helps American individuals. Richard Johnson, writing for the Urban Institute on July 26, 2018, explains that the minimum wage increases empowers individuals who have been trapped in the cycle of poverty, and that's quantified by Vox in 2019, telling us that a $15 federal minimum wage would boost pay for 27 million US workers, lifting 1.3 million households out of poverty. And by reducing wealth inequality, you free thousands of Americans from the shackles of poverty. And that impact is further extended by Section 2A, something no other speaker has really addressed besides the previous one. It essentially mandates that companies continue their headcount levels and provides job security to your constituents. That's the most important impact in this debate, but you only access it if you affirm. It is at this point that this debate shifts from the politics of affirming to the citizens it affects. But secondly, let's go line by line down the negation and see why they lose this debate dollar by dollar. First, Senator Zhao tells you that buybacks are good because they bring more money to the company. But what he doesn't tell you is that stock buybacks artificially inflate the value of the company. And furthermore, this legislation only applies to companies with revenue streams over $250 million that are currently receiving funding from the government. That's more than enough for them to be able to compete with a fluctuating market. Then Senator Bendock tells you that this destroys small businesses. Yes, I understand it doesn't have all Americans, but helping some is better than none because it is a comparative debate. And lastly, Senator Joel Fears switches to automation, but understand that Section A specifically mandates that companies keep current headcounts. Regardless of the minimum wage increases, companies aren't going to lay off workers because of the $2 trillion stimulus package. It's not often that we debate legislation like this one, and it's evident that this legislation gives us a chance to shatter yesterday's economic policy and give Americans hope for tomorrow. Affirm.
The judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 7 seconds. Everyone raise your hand to be called on for questioning in the box. That goes to Senator Wang.
Hi, Senator. How much of nonprofit revenue comes from government grants?
All right, so obviously government grants aren't like a huge part, but I would say that with the $2 trillion stimulus, we're going to see enough for them to stay afloat.
Can you give me a number about, like, for every dollar, how much of nonprofit revenue comes from these grants?
I'm sure you can tell me
80
later.
cents. When minimum wage increases for privately owned companies, how do nonprofits respond?
Right, so actually it's only for $250 million companies, which aren't nonprofits necessarily.
Thank you, Senator Ranjan.
Hi, Senator. So let's look at it based off of economics for a second. If companies aren't making revenue, and with this legislation, we want them to uphold their current payrolls and a minimum wage of $15, can you tell me where in this bill they get the money to do that if the revenues are already dropping?
Right, first is the $2 trillion stimulus package that was passed last week. But secondly, when you empower workers with the minimum wage, you increase the value of the company.
So this legislation gives a lot.
Questioning time has now elapsed. We will move back to a negation cycle of debate. All speakers use the hand function to indicate they want to speak. Just give me a second because it's coming in. It's difficult to see in the format. Ooh, hold on. People are adding. If I'm seeing everyone correctly, that should go to Senator Javeri.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I know it's been a while. This is Representative Javeri, Javeri. I spoke sixth on the last legislation, if that helps you find my ballot. I'm at everyone's leisure. Just give me any indication when you're ready, and I'll be happy to begin. Good here, and third judge is good. Okay, great. In a time like this, thousands of men, women, children around the United States are relatively inspired by shows like Shark Tank, which encourage us to take the proactive step in trying to build our own businesses, make our own capital, and reinvest in our own communities. But just like the sharks, this legislation is forcing this Congress to act like the very same predators circling the troubled waters, forcing us to drown our companies under crippling debt, forcing us to fish every single practice of our businesses, and most dangerously, forcing us to kill those companies that are most vulnerable to us. Fail this legislation, first, because this forces companies to lay off workers. This situation puts us in very troubled waters because no one in today's debate has addressed which companies specifically are going to be affected by this legislation. From Ms. Mehta to Mr. Khan, both of you explained that the $3 trillion stimulus as a general overview over all the companies, but that's not what this legislation does. I want everyone to look very closely to Section 1 of this piece of legislation, where it says that only companies that are making over $250 million of revenue are going to get access to this. And the question here, answer me, Mr. Vias, of which companies this is covering, it's the larger companies, as Section 2B stipulates that large companies have to raise wages to $15. And considering that the definition of a large company is between 500 and 10,000 employees, they also have to keep up with that number. So in a time like this, Mr. Zhao, large companies aren't bankrupt because of the offset between earnings and expenditure. It's because they simply don't have the cash because we're forcing upon them things like the CARE Act, which provide, as the National Review explains just yesterday, under Trump's Stimulus CARE Act, businesses have to retain 90% of the workforce at full compensation. And when you couple that with the fact that they have to combine with a $15 wage, it makes this legislation extremely unfeasible. So Mr. Khan, you put the burden on the negation to prove why this legislation is bad. Allow me to go through it. 1, this is the worst recession we've faced over a 100-year period. 2, every large company has to provide workers with $15. 3, on top of that, they have to provide each worker a 90% compensation throughout the entire company. And 4, they have no loan buyback programs because the CARE Act doesn't allow large companies to have any loan protection programs. But the next reason I would like you to negate this legislation is because of a geographic principle called brain drain, which happens after recessions and specifically under Section 2E, which allows employees to buy stocks inside of companies. Because generally at the beginning of a recession, when the stock is low and you let employees buy into Section 2E, they keep the share until the stock goes extremely high. They sell it at the highest point. Thus, after they sell it, they're extremely rich and don't have an incentive to work anymore. For example, after the 2008 recession, Intel had a 17% employee leave rate because they had let employees buy back into stocks. We don't want our own employees from our largest companies leaving us for work. It's time for us to stop being predators and start being policymakers.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 8 seconds. All questioners indicate with a hand raise. And it'll give me a second just so I can look through and see everything. Tiffany Zhao.
You're on mute, Representative. Or I can't hear you.
Doesn't it go to Representative Farage?
Right, so I did not see Representative Farage on there. And even in the questioning, Senator Zhao is before her. So Senator Zhao, you have the questioning period. We'll start now. We cannot hear you, or I cannot hear you. I'm just going to pause and not do the questioning period for 1 second. Yeah, okay, we'll skip your question for now. Let me look at the other list of people. That goes to Senator Voss.
All right, thank you. If companies take this money, they have to abide by all the stipulations, correct?
They don't have money because we're forcing them to keep
Yeah,
90%
right, but the
of their
companies-
workers employed.
The companies that are taking this money have to abide by these stipulations.
It's the large companies, correct, that don't
Right.
have any capital
And
because
then-
we're forcing a $15 minimum wage on them.
Right. But what does Section 2A say?
Section 2A?
Yes, I believe it's your entire speech revolves around not
funds appropriated by Congress used to keep current payroll headcount levels. Yeah, that's even better because then that means they have to keep 100% of their people, so which even increases their amount of.
That these companies are going to lay people off, but they
Senator
legally
Zhao will
cannot
try
do
to.
They have to furlough employees.
Senator Zhao.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So bouncing off that previous line of questioning, let me just clarify what Representative Vyas was trying to say. So basically, Section 2A literally says that these companies have to maintain the payroll and headcount levels, and we are going to give them all the funds necessary to do so. So how will they be laying off workers?
No legislation has given them the funds available. This is specifically targeted to large companies who have to retain 100% of their employees. When you multiply that number by $15, which doubles the current wage, it equates to over a $250 million valuation.
But won't we just be giving them all the funds necessary to do that, though, even if the
there
number
are no funds allocated under this
Thank you. The
legislation
questioning
that large
period
companies
has now elapsed. We will move back to an affirmative cycle of debate. All affirmative speakers, raise your placard, or my apologies, do the hand function because it's still lagging. That's just going to take a second for that to come in. Just wait for me real quick. That should go to Senator Farage.
I thank the chair once again. That's Senator Farage. It's spelled F-A-R-A-J. Can I have an indication from my judges and then I'll get started? I see 1, 2, 3. Awesome. All right. I'm starting my personal timer as well. This COVID-19 pandemic has taught us a lot. As a country, we've seen our biggest insufficiencies magnified to an unprecedented level. And we know that we might not be able to change the past. But what we can do is make the situation better now and for millions in the future. Let's break down the arguments of each side of today's debate and see why ultimately the affirmation solves for not only the concerns of now, but also the concerns of the future. Immediately, this legislation will improve financial security by prioritizing essential workers. Senator Zhao tried to tell us that buybacks are beneficial for companies, But let's be realistic here. Listen to Senator Mehta. The only people who benefit from buybacks are the executives already exploiting their workers. In fact, Irene Tung from the National Employment Law Project explains on July of 2018 that the money dedicated towards buybacks and dividends benefits rich shareholders while harming the workers who've built their company. There is no guarantee that all or even a large portion of the money that is currently used for investing will be redirected to workers after you pass this legislation. But at the very least, Section 2B mandates that workers make at least $15 per hour. Those who are making such significant contributions to our country right now should not have to worry about where their children's next meal is coming from. Senator Zhao, we should not prioritize corporate executives over the lives of the Americans we serve. But let's also look to the impact in the short term, because this legislation prepares companies to provide for their workers as soon as they can return to the economy. In fact, Heather Long of the Washington Post explains just 2 days ago that there are currently 22 million Americans who are unemployed inside the United States. Companies might not be able to provide their workers unpaid leave right now, but even after social distancing ends, this legislation still applies. So as long as they're given a stimulus, they still have to provide that minimum wage of $15 to their employees. But Senator Ranjan, Bendock, Joel, and Javari are all concerned about how we can ensure that increasing the minimum wage won't just lead to more layoffs. Let's settle this point once and for all. Realize that as a February 2019 report by Ben Zipperer of the Economic Policy Institute explains, a $15 minimum wage would increase productivity, especially for workers with the lowest wages right now. Senator Bendock and Senator Joel, companies are incredibly desperate right now to make more profit. When we increase the productivity of their workers, we ensure that companies are benefiting exponentially. So they don't need to lay off workers in the long run, and they don't need to limit their cash reserves. And finally, in the future, after we pass this legislation, essential workers are able to gain savings so that if anything like this were to ever happen again, they finally don't have to prioritize their work over their life. Think about all of the Americans we serve. Don't be blindsided by the negation's rhetoric. Have foresight and affirm.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Everyone use the hand function to indicate they have a question. Just give me a second. Some of them are still off of the speeches. Senator Bendock.
Thank you. So what happens to small businesses when only large corporations offer this minimum wage?
So essentially, we have other stimulus packages that go to these smaller businesses. Right now, these larger businesses are getting a stimulus under the $2.2 trillion package.
But why shouldn't we offer a minimum wage to all Americans to achieve your impacts instead of just those at large corporations?
The thing is, this is going to apply to the workers who are already working there. Companies don't have enough funding to take on more workers. They're just going to regain the ones.
What does that have to do with my question? I'm saying, why don't we offer everyone a minimum wage instead of those at large companies?
Senator Kang.
Okay, why do stock buybacks only benefit the rich and not the poor?
Because essentially what happens is these buybacks benefit the corporate executives because it's taking money that they don't physically have, that's not in cash reserves. It's taking money that's made from investments in the economy and then buying it back. And that is only going to the top of the company.
They're buying them back, so they have to pay the people who own the stocks, right? So aren't people still earning money?
No, that's the thing, is it's not
Thank
real
you. The
money.
questioning time has now elapsed.
Senator Donaldson, I'm going to have to pause the session for just a moment.
Okay.
We will extend it as needed. I'm going to create a breakout room. Ursula, could you help me facilitate that? I'm going to send to you in the chat the individuals that we are inviting into this breakout room. Everyone else, just hang tight if you are not in that breakout room.
Thank you everyone for your patience.
Wonderful. We'll continue on the cycle of debate.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, we're in a pause at the moment.
Oh, I thought you said to keep going.
That's okay. It's not a problem. This is going to take a few minutes, so please bear with us, folks.
Just out of curiosity, was everyone able to hear me? Did anything cut out? Okay, good. Thank you.
I can hear about half the words at this point, and I also don't think my hand is raising.
Okay, so I'm going to ask that all participants, unless you are contacted about what's going on right now, please turn your mic and camera off until we get back going.
Okay, thank you.
Parley,
Hi there, Senator Hurley.
will we still begin the next session at 3 o'clock, or what's happening with that?
I'm waiting to hear from Tab. I will let you know as soon as I have that information. Ursula has posted in the chat box our end time is by 2:30 Eastern time. And so we will extend up until that point, and I will let you know regarding our second session start time. Oh, we're going to begin that on time. Okay, I'm going to kick it back over to our presiding officer so we can get through as many speeches.
Okay, hi everyone. It's nice to have everyone back. Let's just jump right into it. We ended on an affirmative speech. So all negation speakers, will you please put your hand raised in the thing, just because it's still lagging a little bit. Sorry, they're loading. Just give me 1 second. That should go to Senator Smith.
I thank the chair. All right, and just to make sure, judges, Parley, PO, are we ready? Perfect, thank you so much. Due to technical difficulties, I have not been able to hear the last 15 minutes of the chamber, except for the main ideas, and I've been getting a lot of the questions. Due to technical difficulties, our Congress has neglected to focus on the issues at hand, and which is the reason we have to negate today's legislation. First, Representative Joel, you earlier with On the Flow talked about the median pay, minimum wage, and how extra manufacturing costs are going to go down since they're going to be less actual workers in different manufacturing and more production of robots. I completely agree with this issue, but is a reason why we must fail today's legislation. With the median pay being set at a new rise of $15, almost $8 above the $7 current federal minimum wage, we are going to be putting an unnecessary burden onto multiple companies within the United States. When that burden happens, since companies within the United States are for profit, they're going to start using more offshore workers. They're going to start more mechanization instead of having actual workers in their plants. And that is going to hurt our American constituents, no matter how you frame it. Representative Metro, you talked briefly about domestic abuse previously on the flow, but that levels of domestic abuse seen in Spain and now flowing into the United States is something not caused by the trades of stock, instead of the stay-at-home orders. The United States, according to CNN on April 4th, 2020, stated that the rise in domestic abuse can be most attributed to more people being home with their abusers. But the United States had the option to stop this issue before it even happened. There was the US government in 2017, Trump administration was pressed about a debriefing book about a pandemic that was created during the Obama administration. This playbook put steps into order of what to happen if a pandemic were to start spreading in any continent and how to process it within the United States. President Donald Trump in 2017 threw out that playbook and the entire office, which was made to create it to prevent the spread of pandemics. Because of that, there was an increase of spread after the original COVID-19 reached the United States, which caused unnecessary harm to our constituents. The rise in domestic abuse is not because of traded stocks. It's not because our constituents, specifically our female constituents, don't have enough expendable income. It's because they're currently being held in stay-at-home orders in all 50 states because the United States government failed to protect the constituents by listening to previous administrations. The issue with this legislation is not specifically talking about, the issue with this legislation is working and going to hurt our constituents. Raising the minimum wage is going to increase reliance on offshore working as well as increase industrialization. And all of the talk about the dividends and shareholders is something that is non-unique. The way that the stock market is run is not going to be changed significantly when this piece of legislation is passed, and it must be filled in order to protect both our companies and our constituents. So today we fail.
For the judges, that was a speech of 2 minutes and 59 seconds. All questioners, raise your hand in the box. That should go to Senator Mehta.
Hi, so you're right that abuse rates did go up because of stay-at-home orders. Now, do you think that these rates would have gone up or down with added financial dependency onto someone's partner?
So if you were listening to my first point, it was explaining how if the minimum wage goes up, it's not necessarily
Right.
going to help our constituents because of offshore manufacturing and increased reliance on
Okay, but
industrialization. Because
not regarding, like, not like in regards to that point, but simply giving people more disposable income. Does that lessen or increase financial dependency onto their partners? Hello?
So if someone has increased financial.
Sorry, we have to end that question period. Go to
It's okay. I'm really struggling to hear.
Senator Farage.
Hi, Senator. So what happens if a worker is given more money? What happens to how they work?
So that's a great question. Within the United States, you have to specifically talk about which like sector.
No, I'm talking about their productivity. Does it go up or down?
It depends on what line of work they're in. If you're going to
So you're saying that an increase in wage doesn't increase productivity?
Not necessarily, no. Because if it's the
Why
same
not?
laws holding someone, if it's the same rules holding someone accountable.
But
with
now they
different-
have more of a reason to work hard, right?
Not necessarily. If it's being put across the board and everyone has that exact same raise. That's
Thank you. The questioning period has now elapsed. Still sorry about the tech issues, but just to kind of keep everything, we just have to keep going. We will now move on for an affirmative speech in the cycle. All speakers raise your hand, not placard, but hand on the thing. Hold on, they're all coming in. That should go to Senator Bokill.
I think the chair, oh, my hand is still up, sorry. Okay, I thank the chair. This is Senator Bokill speaking for the second time today, still spelled B-O-K-I-L. Judges, please let me know if you're ready and let me know if anything's lagging. Thank you, thank you. Parley, okay, thank you. After the Great Depression, FDR signed the New Deal, which was an effort to revitalize the economy as a whole. A few decades later, we had the Great Society programs, which tried to solve the problem of poverty and social inequity. Throughout history, everything has been done in categories. But today, we are the first Congress that has the ability to pass legislation that combines all of these ideals. Not only is it going to help the economy, but it's also going to help the problem of inequality. I beg of you to stand with me and affirm. Now, before I start my presentation, it's important to understand what's going on under the status quo and what's going to happen whether we pass or fail today's piece of legislation. CNBC explains in March 25th of 2020 that Senate currently passed a $2 trillion plan, and this is being debated in the House today. The $2 trillion economic relief plan approved by the Senate includes direct payments to Americans, strengthened unemployment insurance, loans to businesses, and increased healthcare resources. This is going to be signed whether we pass or fail. So what's the issue? The issue is that both small businesses and large businesses are both included within this one plan together. So why is this problematic? Well, the New York Times explains in March of 2020 that due to historic precedents, it's obvious that the government always prioritizes larger businesses because of their connection to larger businesses, monopolization, and potential lobbying. So when we pass this $2 trillion plan, a lot of the loans are going to go to the larger businesses. This piece of legislation solves for that. How? Well, representatives on the negation basically looked at two main arguments. They said that passing today's piece of legislation doesn't help small businesses, and Representative Zhao said large businesses are not going to be able to use dividends, so it's going to hurt them. I'm going to take those two arguments and flip it to the affirmation. I would argue passing today's piece of legislation is essential because it actually controls these large businesses in a way that can potentially help them, but is also going to help the smaller businesses as a whole. Why? Because larger businesses know that they're not going to be able to pay the dividends unless their own treasury is able to come up with enough money to surpass the amount that they gain from the loan. So what are they going to do? They're not going to ask for as much money for the loan because they're going to work it in a way where they prioritize how much they gain and how much they can actually profit off of. So what's going to happen is these large companies aren't going to ask for as much money from the Congress, leaving enough money to give to smaller businesses as well. And when they ask for this money, they're going to be able to provide the profit because their dividends are going to be able to be sold. But not only that, there's been a huge problem with taxes, and minimum wage hurting the economy. Washington Post on April 2nd of 2020 explains most large businesses making revenues of $100 million already pay most of their employers more than $15 per hour. So this entire argument falls. You have to pass today's legislation because it controls the businesses and doesn't actually hurt the economy. Pass.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. All questioners, please raise your hand in the box. Sorry, some of them are still moving around. Give me 1 second. That goes to Senator Wang.
Hi, Senator. Why won't minimum wage increases result in higher prices for consumers?
Okay, so as I explained, the Washington Post in April of 2020 says that
Right.
most of the companies who make more than 100 million already give their like employers at least $15.
But then how do other companies compensate for decreased profit?
Okay, I don't believe that like decreased profit is going to occur. The way that this legislation is built is it controls these large businesses because it makes sure that they don't get.
I understand what you said. I understand what you said in your speech about those large businesses.
Thank you, Senator Javaри.
Thank you. Hi, Ms. Pokel. So what happens when there's a net brain drain?
Okay, I don't necessarily think that's going to happen, right? I think we're in a recession right now where
Exactly. So
yeah.
if a recession is occurring and employees buy stocks at very low rates and they sell them when the
I don't think an employee is gonna get like super rich and like quit their job because of the stock that they're applying.
In 2008, Intel actually furloughed 17% of their employees after the recession because people sold their stocks.
The questioning period has now elapsed. For our last speech of today's round, we will move to the negation cycle. All negative speakers, please raise your placards or use the hand function for that. Sorry, they're all coming in. Questioners are changing. Give me 1 second. That should go to Senator Hurley.
Hello, everyone. That is Senator Jonathan Hurley speaking for the second time this session. And as it would appear the last time this session overall. For my judges, just give me some sort of sign and we'll get going. Senators, I'm disappointed in this Congress because consistently throughout this debate, we have avoided the principal matter we should be addressing on the affirmation and the negation. The framework through which we should be assessing today's piece of legislation is simple but has been ignored. Does limiting how corporations can spend bailout money we allocate to them help or hurt the American people in times of crisis? The most basic way to answer this type of question is to look at the long-term impact on American workers. An article from the New York State Society of Certified Public Accountants broke down how approximately 60% of workers work for some sort of corporation or company that could realistically generate up to $250 million a year annually or more. Now, Senator Voice, you said at the beginning of this debate that the piece of legislation is going to effectively help workers. But Section 1, Section 2, subsection A stipulates that any aid we provide to companies has to go directly to workers at all times. And there's no stipulations as of whether or not it's a time of crisis or specific circumstances. If we are giving them money and they make more than $250 million a year, it has to go directly to workers for their paychecks. He claimed this is a good thing, and that it's similar to what we did in the 2008 financial crisis. The only problem is that as a CNN Business Post from March of this year stipulated, it outlined how whenever we bail out corporations, as we did in the 2008 financial crisis, it's not just for the short-term reason of restarting the economy, it's to provide them with resources to reestablish themselves in the long term. So no matter, you're right, the current package isn't good enough, but this is going to make future ones impossible. The issue with this piece of legislation is that it prevents corporations from being able to gain access to these resources. Instead, they just have to hand off any funds they receive directly to workers. They cannot work to rebuild their economic capital using it in times of panic. Whereas workers can get access to unemployment benefits that are more relaxed, such as what occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, let's talk about specifically how this piece of legislation would impact global pandemics like COVID-19. Bloomberg News wrote in March of 2020 that under the COVID-19 stimulus bill of roughly $3 trillion, major healthcare corporations received $11 billion in aid to help with development of a vaccine for the novel coronavirus. Live Science wrote 3 days ago that a coronavirus cure is far out, but with the introduction of government aid, we now have a fighting chance of creating some sort of vaccine within the next 3 to 6 months. The only way these corporations will be able to spend the funds they were given under section 2, subsection A of this piece of legislation will be to pay their workers. It can't help them get resources for testing areas or provide the necessary personal protective equipment that workers need and that we're facing a shortage of at the moment. Senator Tang, we're not being unfair in the status quo. We're trying to make sure our workers are alive to have a chance at a better life once this is over. Senator Mehta, the most important impact in this discussion is that of human life. First and foremost, we're risking up to 480,000 of them in the United States, as reported by the CDC in March, if we do not contain the novel coronavirus. And this piece of legislation prevents us from aiding corporations in doing just that. Therefore, we must negate.
For the judges, that was a speech of 3 minutes and 5 seconds. For our final questioning period, speakers, please raise your hand. Give me a second. They're all changing from the other one. Oh, hold on. Sorry, people are still. That goes to Senator Bogle.
Okay, so let's do like a weighing activity real quick, right? If we fail today's piece of legislation, then the $1 trillion plan that's already existing is just going to give a lot of money to larger businesses. If we pass, we can control.
If we fail today's piece of legislation, the $11 billion we're giving to develop a vaccine disappears.
Because why does it disappear?
Let me read the exact section of legislation that refers to that. It says that
why can't we pass future legislation that just like
we won't, because this legislation makes it impossible for us to allocate funds for anything other than workers' payments.
Then why can't we, like, where does it like blatantly
Section 1, subsection A. No, section 2, subsection A.
Is a vaccine not helping?
Directly for monetary aid to workers, nothing else.
Is a vaccine not helping the workers because it?
But that's not direct payment. You're on mute, Senator.
Right, okay, if we're committed to both these groups, businesses and workers, why can't we just give them the amount of money necessary to both rebuild their company and help workers at the same time?
Because the legislation bars us from being able to do
No,
that.
that's not true. It's an additional restriction. It's not like, oh, from now on, we can't give them any money. It's the money in section 1, the loan guarantees, the direct cash infusion. The purpose of those, can I finish my question? The purpose of those is for rebuilding. The restrictions in today's legislation adds on to that.
Can you reiterate the first part of that for me?
More funds additional to the direct cash infusions, loan guarantees currently in the status quo that are being used to rebuild the company. So
thank you. Additional questioning time has now elapsed. Seeing as we've reached our hard stop at 2:30, I will unilaterally move to previous question. All those who wish to pass today's piece of legislation, please raise your placards just to have a visual, since we're just voting.
Would you like us to vote in the chat?
No, that's fine. Now, like, since it's not like we're having to do it under time pressure, I can see. All those who wish to fail. Any abstentions? On a vote of 6 to 9 to 0, this piece of legislation does fail. And I will unilaterally move to adjourn as well, calling for orders of the day of today's session, and we will reconvene at our time of 3 o'clock. Before we all go though, I just wanted to remind the chamber, although we've had a lot of technological issues, I'm glad we all worked through it together. I know it made my time as PO harder. I know it made you guys as speakers have more difficulties, but I was your presiding officer, Emily Donaldson, today. Even with all that, we got through 27 speeches and 38 questions. So I think everyone did a great job.
Thank you so much, everyone. Please come back on 5 minutes before we are scheduled to begin. And judges, if you could please stay on because I need to talk to you at the end of the session. Just going to wait for all of our students to leave first. Thank you, everyone. See you shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just real quick, is anyone else? Okay, so specifically Alexandra Smith and Danny Tang.
Senator, can we please do this in another space? I need to talk to our judges and we don't have a lot of time in between.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm just waiting for our live stream to end and then I will talk to you privately. I think I can